Imagine yourself in a quiet medieval village, where the pace of life is slower than anything we know today. The sun has already slipped beyond the western hills, leaving behind only a faint afterglow that fades into deepening blue. Lanterns flicker gently in doorways, casting their soft halos onto the earth-packed streets. A faint mist rises from the fields beyond, drifting across hedgerows and curling like pale ribbons over thatched rooftops. The air smells of damp soil, wood smoke, and the lingering sweetness of hay cut weeks before. Inside stone cottages, hearth fires are banked low, their embers glowing a steady orange that hums with warmth and quiet reassurance. The crackle of firewood becomes a companion to the stillness, a sound as steady as a heartbeat. Life here is simple, though never easy. Villagers know that tomorrow will bring labor in the fields, tending livestock, or repairing tools that wear down with use. Yet tonight, as the world slows, there is a gentle pause. Families gather around the table to share bread darkened by coarse grains, perhaps softened with broth or cheese. A candle or small oil lamp throws shadows across the timber beams overhead. Children listen as elders murmur stories of saints, or of distant times when kings fought wars that barely touched this quiet corner of the world. The sound of voices blends with the low hum of night insects beyond the cottage walls, creating a rhythm of reassurance, a reminder that even in hardship, life carries on. This was the world of medieval Europe, a time when health was fragile, and illness arrived often and without warning. Epidemics swept through villages like a silent wind, leaving fear in their wake. Yet to truly understand how people endured, we must look not only at sickness, but at the patterns of daily life that gave them strength. The medieval villager did not measure time by calendars pinned to walls, but by the steady sequence of chores, seasons, and rituals. Each sunrise brought expectation, each sunset offered, if not rest, then a moment of closeness, of prayer, of resignation mixed with hope. We might imagine a village under the shadow of illness as a place of despair, but it was also a place of remarkable endurance. When plagues struck, people still woke to tend fields, because crops would not wait. Cows still needed milking, bread still needed baking. Even in grief, the rhythm of necessity guided survival. Behind every account of pestilence or famine lies this quieter truth, that resilience was born not from great victories, but from the countless small actions of ordinary folk who kept going. Think of the tools they relied on: wooden plows dragged by oxen, scythes sharpened each morning, and clay ovens that radiated warmth through stone walls. Picture the herbs hanging in bundles from cottage rafters, meant for both flavor and healing. Some herbs were brewed into teas for fevers, others pressed into poultices for wounds. A sprig of rosemary, a leaf of sage, a root of garlic, these were as valued as coins when illness came. Healing was never certain, yet the act of preparing these remedies gave families a sense of agency, a reminder that they were not entirely powerless. And then there were the rituals, for faith wove itself into every aspect of daily life. At dawn, church bells called villagers to prayer, their tones rolling across misty meadows and echoing against the wooden beams of barns. In times of sickness, these bells tolled longer, more often, their sound both mournful and reassuring. People prayed not only for deliverance, but for strength to endure what could not be changed. Evenings might end with hymns sung softly by lamplight, words carried gently upward as if to mingle with the smoke drifting from chimneys. Faith, like bread, was shared daily, sustaining body and spirit alike. Survival, however, was not only about prayer or remedies, it was also about community. Neighbors shared food when a family's harvest failed. A widow might receive help repairing her thatch roof before winter rains set in. Children carried water from wells for those too weak to walk. These small exchanges, unremarkable in themselves, formed the invisible web that held villages together when epidemics threatened to pull them apart. In this sense, survival was never just individual, it was woven collectively through cooperation and care. The night, too, carried its own comforts. Imagine lying down on a straw-stuffed mattress, beneath woolen blankets that smelled faintly of lanolin. Outside, the streets of the village are hushed. The only sounds a distant owl, the shuffle of livestock in their stalls, or the trickle of water from a stream winding through the meadow. A lamp burns low beside the bed, its flame dancing softly, creating shadows on the whitewashed walls. For children especially, this small flame was a guardian against the unknown dark. Even for adults, its glow carried reassurance. The world had not vanished. only softened into quiet shapes until morning returned. As dawn approached, lamps and candles would be extinguished, giving way to the pale light of the rising sun. Another day would begin, and so the cycle continued: work, rest, faith, and endurance woven together by the simplest of rituals. Epidemics may have altered the rhythm, but they did not erase it. People found ways to carry forward, to blend grief with duty, and to hold fast to the small joys of existence: the laughter of children, the warmth of bread, the comfort of familiar hymns sung in stone chapels. In this gentle story, we will not dwell on terror or catastrophe. Instead, we will move slowly, chapter by chapter, through the details of how medieval villagers lived in the shadow of sickness and how they found strength in ordinary acts. We will walk the muddy lanes of their settlements, sit at their wooden tables, watch them tend their gardens, and join them as they gather herbs or mend tools. We will listen to the bells that mark the passing hours and to the whispers of the wind across empty fields. And through it all, we will see how life persisted fragile, yet enduring, humble, yet remarkable in its quiet strength. So let your breathing slow. Picture the village lanterns dimming, the mists settling across the fields, the river carrying the night's hush downstream. Allow the story of survival to unfold like a slow melody, one note at a time. The night is long, and history will speak softly. The world begins in quiet. The first pale light creeps gently over the horizon, touching the fields outside a medieval village with a soft, silver glow. For a moment, the landscape looks almost frozen, as though time itself has paused to take a breath. Mist drifts low across the meadows, blurring the edges of hedgerows and making every tree stand like a shadow from a dream. The cool air carries with it the scents of damp earth, dew-soaked grass, and smoke rising from hearths newly kindled. It is morning, and another day has begun. The rooster's crow breaks the silence, though not harshly, only as a gentle signal that the night has ended. In the distance, church bells toll softly, their sound rolling over the quiet fields and into the cottages clustered near the village square. The bells do not only call people to prayer, they mark the rhythm of the day, setting its pace before the first foot has stepped into the soil. Villagers stir in their beds, made of straw and covered in rough woolen blankets. The cottages are small, their walls of wattle and daub, their roofs of thatch. A single room often serves many purposes: cooking, eating, sleeping. The fire at the hearth, kept alive through the night, is stirred again, coaxed back into flame with fresh wood or dried peat. Its glow spreads warmth slowly into the chilly air as families rise and prepare for the work ahead. Even in sickness, mornings could not be ignored. Epidemics did not pause the sun's rising, and so they did not pause the demands of daily life. Crops required tending, animals needed feeding, and water had to be drawn. Survival was not a matter of choice, it was a rhythm that carried everyone forward. And even when bodies were weak and fears were heavy, the day had to begin. Outside, the village is hushed but alive. Doors creak open, and figures step into the cool morning air. Women carry buckets toward the well, their wooden shoes clattering softly against the packed earth of the lane. Men shoulder tools, hoes, scythes, wooden plows, pulled by patient oxen waiting in their pens. Children, still sleepy, gather firewood or chase stray chickens back into their coops. The fields spread wide beyond the village boundaries, divided by hedges and low fences. They are not neat or perfect, but patchworked with strips of rye, barley, or oats, each family farming its own share. In the early light, the dew on the crops glistens like silver. The soil is dark and damp beneath bare or leather-clad feet, a reminder that the land itself is both the source of life and the measure of toil. Morning tasks begin quietly, almost reverently. Oxen are yoked, their breath steaming in the cold air. Hoes break the soil, each dull thud joining the rhythm of birdsong. A woman kneels to check the cabbages growing behind her cottage, brushing a slug away from the damp leaves. An older man sharpens his sickle on a whetstone, preparing for the harvest that will soon arrive. These are the images of continuity unchanged for centuries, repeated with small variations each dawn. Yet beneath this calm routine lies the shadow of sickness. Epidemics moved through villages without warning, striking the young, the old, the strong, and the weak alike. A cough in the night might spread to a fever by morning. A mother stirring her pot of porridge may already feel the ache of an illness she cannot name. A father leading his ox to the plough may hide the heaviness in his limbs. Still, life demanded movement. The morning routine did not wait for the luxury of rest. Even when half a household was sick, the other half carried the burden, tending to both chores and care. Neighbors, too, lent hands when they could, feeding livestock, drawing water, or leaving loaves of bread on doorsteps where illness had struck hardest. In this way, the morning light did not only reveal fields and cottages, it revealed endurance. It showed the quiet courage of ordinary people, rising each day to meet the world again, even when fear walked beside them. Within cottages, the morning meal was simple but steady. A crust of bread baked days before, softened in broth or ale. A porridge of oats, barley, or millet, stirred with wooden spoons until thick and steaming. Sometimes there was milk or cheese pressed from the evening's curdling, or perhaps an egg collected from a hen's nest. Meat was rare for most, but herbs from the garden added flavor and variety. The smell of bread, even coarse and dark, gave comfort. Its rising, its baking, its breaking, all were rituals that carried weight beyond hunger. To share bread was to share life. And so, each morning, families ate together, however briefly, before scattering into their daily labors. What did they feel in these mornings of light and shadow? The quiet joy of seeing a child laugh, or the heaviness of knowing that same child might fall sick tomorrow? The gratitude of a healthy body, bending to tie the straps of a leather shoe, or the weariness of rising with aching joints? Hope and fear mingled, never separate. The rhythm of the day carried both, like two notes in the same tune. As the sun rose higher, the mist began to thin. The outlines of the village sharpened, and the fields glowed with gold. The bell in the church tower tolled again, this time marking the hour for prayer. Some paused in their work, bowing heads where they stood, whispering words for protection, for healing, for the strength to face another day. Faith did not cure disease, but it offered a kind of scaffolding for the spirit, a way to place suffering into a larger frame of meaning. The people of these villages could not control the spread of sickness, but they could control how they rose to meet it, and faith gave them a sense of steadiness. By mid-morning, the village was fully alive. Smoke rose from chimneys, oxen pulled steadily through furrows, and children's laughter mingled with the cries of crows circling overhead. The air was filled with the mixed scents of damp hay, warm bread, and manure. Life was not easy, and never free from worry, but it was continuous. The epidemics that swept through the land were frightening, but they did not erase the ordinary pulse of daily existence. Morning light over quiet fields reminded people that life, however fragile, still moved forward, step by step, task by task, dawn after dawn. And when the day would end, when the sun sank and lamps were lit again, the cycle would begin anew, repeating as faithfully as the turning of the seasons. Morning light was more than just the beginning of a day. It was a promise, quiet and steady, that life, despite hardship, despite sickness, would continue. The heart of every medieval cottage was the hearth. It was more than a place to cook food, more than a pile of wood set aflame. It was warmth against the cold, safety against the dark, and a symbol of life itself continuing even in the face of fear. When epidemics circled outside the cottage walls, unseen and unpredictable, the hearth offered a kind of stillness. Its glow was steady when nothing else was certain. Families would gather close around it, huddling together on benches, stools, or even the floor, as flames licked gently against the logs and the smoke curled upward toward the thatched roof. In this quiet space, time seemed to soften, measured not by hours but by the rhythm of the crackling wood, the bubbling pot, the soft breaths of children dozing against their mother's shoulders. The hearth was the pulse of the home, and to keep it alive was to keep hope alive. In the mornings, when the fire had burned low through the night, the first task was to stir the embers. Ash was pushed aside with an iron poker or a stick cut from the hedgerow, and the faint glow of hidden coals revealed itself. A small puff of air, the placing of kindling dry twigs, bark, or strand, the fire was coaxed back to life. There was always relief in seeing flame return, relief that one more day had begun. Smoke crept up through the smoke hole in the roof, sometimes clinging stubbornly to the rafters, filling the room with a haze that clung to clothing and hair. But no one complained. The sting in the eyes was a sign of warmth. To lose the fire was to lose safety, and so its smoke was tolerated, even welcomed. Around the hearth, meals were prepared in ways that tied people together. A pot of broth simmered slowly, its steam carrying scents of cabbage, onions, leeks, or herbs plucked from a small garden patch. Sometimes there was a bone left from the slaughter of an animal, boiled again and again to stretch its flavor into the thin liquid. Sometimes only grains, thickened into a porridge, filled the pot. Meat was rare, and fish came only when rivers or markets allowed. But even the simplest food gained meaning when shared around the fire. Wooden bowls were filled and passed by hand. Spoons carved from local wood were dipped in, and the act of eating together carried both comfort and ritual. In times of sickness, when fear crept in through every door, the hearth's meal gave strength not only to the body but to the spirit. The taste did not matter as much as the presence. The steam rising from the pot was proof that life continued. Children found comfort in the hearth's glow, lying on the floor to watch sparks rise into the air like tiny stars. They would trace shapes in the ashes, or play with scraps of wood left beside the fire. Old stories were told there, the voice of a grandfather or grandmother carrying softly through the smoky room. Tales of saints, of kings, of beasts and miracles. These were not only entertainments, but ways to give meaning to hardship. As flames danced on the walls, the old stories seemed alive, their shadows stretching long against the rough plaster and timber. The hearth turned storytelling into ceremony, into memory preserved against the erosion of time. For mothers, the fire was both labor and security. They stirred pots, baked coarse bread on iron griddles, and dried clothes near the flames. They warmed water for washing children or soaking weary feet. They spun wool or mended torn garments by its light when days grew short and nights grew long. Their hands were never still, yet the hearth gave them a sense of control, a place where work met comfort. In Epidemics, when much lay beyond human power, the hearth became one of the few things that could still be tended. Keeping the fire alive was an act of defiance against despair. Fathers, too, measured the hearth with respect. They split wood, hauled peat, or gathered brush to feed it, knowing that without steady fuel the household would suffer. In the silence of winter mornings, the sound of an axe striking would carry through the village as a sign that families were preparing not just for warmth, but for survival. To bring home wood was to bring home life, and to lay it beside the hearth was to ensure that tomorrow would also find light in the cottage. Illness changed the meaning of the hearth, but never diminished it. When fevers spread, the hearth became the center of care. Sickbeds were drawn closer to its warmth, and bowls of broth were offered to lips that could barely swallow. Herbal remedies, garlic, sage, thyme were hung above the flames, their scents released into the smoky air. The belief that certain herbs could purify sickness was strong, and even if it did not cure, it comforted. A grandmother might whisper a prayer as she tossed dried rosemary into the fire, watching its sharp scent mingle with the wood. The hearth became a place where hope was tested and renewed, where families leaned on both faith and flame. At night, when the outside world grew still and only the howling of dogs or the distant cry of owls broke the silence, the hearth was a shield against darkness. Its glow flickered on the faces of those half asleep, reminding them that they were not abandoned, that warmth still existed even in the coldest hour. To stare into the fire was to find a rhythm more ancient than words. Flames bent and twisted, sparks flew upward, wood collapsed into glowing embers. The fire lived and died, and yet it was always reborn. For people who lived with the constant presence of death during epidemics, this cycle was both symbol and comfort. The hearth taught them that endings were never final, that life, like flame, could rise again. Even the smallest details of the hearth carried meaning. The iron pot, blackened from years of smoke, was a trusted companion. The wooden spoon, worn smooth by countless hands, was part of the family. The benches and stools, drawn close to the fire, held the impressions of generations. Every object near the hearth absorbed its smoke, its warmth, its scent, and so became part of the family's story. A visitor stepping into a cottage could tell much by the hearth, whether the fire was strong or weak, whether the pot was full or nearly empty, whether laughter or silence filled the smoky air. In the wider rhythm of the village, the hearths together created a shared life. On a cold evening, smoke rising from every thatched roof was a sign of endurance. Each column of smoke was a statement. Here is a family, here is life, here is survival. The smell of burning wood drifted across lanes and fields, mingling into one great cloud of community. Even when doors were shut to guard against sickness, the hearths tied neighbors together, visible in their smoke, audible in their crackles, tangible in their scent. The hearth was never just about warmth or food. It was about belonging. It was about the invisible thread that tied generations, neighbors, and families together. To sit at the hearth was to be inside the circle of safety, to be reminded that life was stronger than the illness that stalked beyond the door. And when morning came, and the embers glowed low again, the cycle began anew. Ash was swept aside, kindling laid down, and flame coaxed once more into being. The rhythm never ended. It was the rhythm of survival itself. And so, in cottages across medieval villages, the hearth remained the quiet refuge of the people. Epidemics could come and go, bringing fear and loss, but the fire kept its steady song. Crackle, smoke, warmth, light, these were the elements of comfort, repeated endlessly. In the language of flame, the villagers found their assurance. Life continued, one breath, one spark, one day at a time. Religion in the medieval world was not an occasional thought, but a constant presence, and in the humbler corners of villages and hamlets, this presence was embodied in small chapels. These chapels were modest, often no more than a single room of stone or timber, their walls rough and cool to the touch, their roofs sometimes thatched, sometimes tiled, but always weathered by the seasons. They stood apart from the cottages, at the edge of fields or near a crossing of paths, and though their doors were plain wood, worn smooth by many hands, they opened into a space that villagers understood as sacred. Within these walls, the anxieties of daily life, illness, hunger, toil, and the looming shadow of death could be carried in silence and set gently before God. The air inside was heavy with the mingled scents of wax, old wood, and damp stone, and even before a word was spoken, the place carried the weight of reverence. Candles flickered along narrow ledges or iron sconces, their light bending against the uneven surface of the walls. The flames never burned steadily. They wavered and swayed as though in constant prayer themselves. Shadows stretched across carved beams, shifting slowly as the candles guttered in unseen drafts. To sit in such a chapel was to enter a rhythm of quietness. One's breathing slowed, one's voice dropped to a whisper, and the rustling of a cloak or the creak of a wooden bench became amplified in the hush. Even children, so often restless in the fields or at the hearth, seemed subdued within these walls, their eyes wide as they watched the candles dance. Faith did not need to thunder here. It lived in the softness, in the steady drip of wax, in the faint echo of whispered words against stone. When illness swept through the village, the chapel became both a place of mourning and of hope. Families gathered to light candles not only for the living but for the departed. A mother might kneel for hours with a rosary of knotted twine slipping through her fingers, each bead or knot a plea for protection. A father, hardened by work and weather, might bow his head in silence, lips moving without sound. The priest, often weary himself, and sometimes as vulnerable to sickness as anyone else, would raise prayers in Latin that few understood fully, yet the sound itself was enough. The cadence, the repetition, the solemn rise and fall of words gave shape to sorrow, turning grief into something held and shared, rather than borne alone. The villagers may not have understood every syllable, but they understood the feeling, and the feeling was what carried them through. The chapel bell was another presence, perhaps the most haunting of all. Its tolling carried across misty fields, drifting over hedgerows and rivers, reaching cottages tucked into the landscape. Sometimes it called the living to prayer, sometimes it announced the passing of a soul. Always it was a sound that drew people together, for no one could hear it and remain untouched. The bell echoed loss, yes, but it also echoed endurance, reminding villagers that their lives were part of a rhythm larger than themselves. When the bell rang, people paused in their tasks, looking up from plough or loom, from hearth or cradle. They made the sign of the cross, whispering words taught since childhood. In that moment, across fields and lanes, a community was united not by sight, but by sound. The rituals within the chapel were small, but their very simplicity carried strength. Kneeling was an act of surrender, and yet it was also an act of grounding, placing one's body in a position of humility, while keeping one's spirit rooted in hope. Crossing oneself was a gesture so familiar that it became like breathing forehead, chest, shoulder, a silent tracing of protection across the body. Whispered words, sometimes as short as Kyrie, Eleisons, or Lord of Mercy, rose like threads of smoke, carrying individual burdens into the collective air of prayer. Each act, repeated countless times, shaped a rhythm of resilience. Just as the hearth marked the continuity of daily life, the chapel marked the continuity of faith, binding days together, not through certainty, but through trust. The walls of these chapels bore witness to centuries of footsteps, Stone thresholds were worn smooth where countless souls had entered, carrying mud from fields or snow from winter paths. Benches sagged in the middle, polished by generations of villagers who sat upon them with folded hands. Frescoes or carvings, often crude and faded, depicted saints with halos brightened long ago by patient hands. Even where the paint had flaked and the colors dulled, the images remained, silent companions to the prayers spoken below. A figure of the Virgin holding the child might stand in a niche, her face serene though her paint was cracked. A wooden crucifix might hang above the altar, Christ's figure rough-hewn but powerful, the grain of the wood showing through. These images were not decorations. They were anchors of faith, visual reminders that suffering was shared, that hope was justified. Children learned their first sense of awe in these spaces. Their mothers would bring them in, guiding their small hands to dip fingers into the cold water of the font, tracing the sign of the cross upon their brows. They would watch wide-eyed as candles flickered, as the priest lifted the host, as villagers whispered prayers they could not yet understand. Over time, the gestures became their own. Faith was not taught in long lessons, but in small acts, repeated daily, absorbed like the warmth of the fire or the scent of bread. The chapel was the school of the Spirit, shaping young hearts through rhythm and silence rather than argument or debate. For the elderly, the chapel was a final refuge, bodies bent by labor, faces lined by years of sun and hardship. They entered with slow steps, leaning on sticks or the arms of kin. Their prayers were often silent, yet heavy with memory. They had seen winters that claimed neighbors, plagues that took children, famines that tested whole villages. Still they came, still they knelt, still they whispered. Their presence was itself a sermon, a testimony that faith endured, not because it answered every question, but because it offered a way to live without answers. When others doubted, the old simply lit another candle, bowed another knee, traced another cross, and in doing so, reminded the younger that resilience was not found in certainty, but in persistence. Sometimes chapels were filled, especially during holy days, with villagers pressing shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with breath and smoke. Other times they were nearly empty, a single figure kneeling in the quiet, the sound of wind pushing against the wooden door. Yet, whether crowded or silent, the chapel always remained what it was meant to be, a vessel for human fragility. It was not grandeur that made it holy, but the willingness of ordinary people to bring their weariness into it and lay that weariness down in prayer. The chapels did not solve the hardships of epidemics or poverty. They did not shield villagers from loss, but they gave those losses a shape, a place, and in that giving, they softened despair. Faith in these small chapels was not about answers but about rhythm, the rhythm of bells, the rhythm of prayers, the rhythm of candles burning low. Each repetition carried the community through days that might otherwise have felt unbearable. Just as farmers trusted the cycle of seasons, villagers trusted the cycle of ritual. Winter would pass, fields would green again, children would grow, the sick would recover or be laid to rest. But through all of it, the chapel remained. Its stones stood still, its candles burned, its prayers echoed, and in that steadiness, people found the courage to take the next step, the next breath, the next day. Thus, in the shadow of illness and the uncertainty of survival, the small chapels of medieval villages offered more than just shelter for prayer. They were sanctuaries of resilience, spaces where sorrow could be spoken aloud or held in silence, where fear could be named and then eased by ritual, where hope could flicker like a candle but never go out. The faith practiced within their walls was quiet, often wordless, always humble, and yet it was powerful. It gave villagers not solutions but endurance, not explanations but strength. And in the toll of the bell across misty fields, in the hush of whispers rising against cold stone, in the sight of a candle's flame bending gently in the air, the people found what they most needed, the assurance that they were not alone, that their lives were held in something greater than themselves, and that even in the darkest nights, light could be found. Medicine in the medieval village was never a science of certainty, but a craft of hope, carried in the quiet gestures of those who knew how to gather, to brew, and to comfort. In cottages where books were scarce and physicians rarer still, health was entrusted to the green gifts of the fields and the forest. Women, often mothers and grandmothers, carried in their memories the names of plants, their properties, their seasons of growth, and the ways they might be coaxed into easing pain. Theirs was a knowledge learned, not in schools but in meadows, at dawn, in gardens beside the door, In long evenings of trial and error, where a sprig too much or too little might mean the difference between relief and disappointment, chamomile was dried in bundles, its scent sweet and faintly of apple. Steeped in hot water to calm nerves and soften troubled sleep. Garlic was eaten raw or pounded into broths, thought to strengthen the body against unseen dangers. Rosemary, its sharp fragrance filling the air, was burned in sick rooms to cleanse away mists of illness. The villagers trusted not because these remedies always worked, but because they were woven into the fabric of their days. Gathering herbs was itself a ritual. Women would set out in the early hours, baskets on their arms, dew still clinging to the grass. They knew where to find the plants that others might overlook. Chamomile hiding low in the meadows, yarrow nodding white along the edges of fields, mint sprouting near the cool trickle of streams. Each plant was tied to a place, a season, a memory. Children sometimes followed, watching as mothers bent low to pick a leaf or flower, hearing the whispered names passed down like lullabies. Knowledge was not written but spoken, shared across generations in kitchens lit by firelight. This for fevers, a grandmother might murmur, placing a sprig in a child's hand. This for wounds, this for when the chest is tight. In these small lessons, survival was sustained. Once gathered, herbs were dried in bunches that hung from rafters, their shadows swaying in the smoke of the hearth. The kitchen became both pharmacy and sanctuary, where leaves crumbled between fingers, where roots were pounded with stones, where teas simmered in earthen pots. The scents mingled with the everyday smell of bread and broth, making healing a part of daily life rather than something set apart. There was no clear boundary between food and medicine, for both were given with the same purpose: to sustain the body, to comfort the spirit. A bowl of onion broth, steaming and strong, was as much a remedy as a meal. A cup of nettle tea was nourishment as well as cure. In this way, healing entered not as a stranger but as a familiar companion, woven seamlessly into the rhythm of the household. When sickness struck, the healer's role extended beyond herbs. A woman would come to the bedside, carrying not only her basket of simples, but also her presence, her voice, her patience. She would lay a hand on the brow, feeling the heat of fever. She would whisper reassurances, telling the family to keep the fire steady, to keep the patient warm but not stifled, to let them sip water slowly. Sometimes she prepared a poultice, warm and damp, pressing it against aching limbs. Sometimes she brewed a tea, lifting the cup gently to cracked lips. These acts, though humble, were more than medicine. They were gestures of care, affirmations that illness was not faced alone. A fever might break, or it might not, but in the meantime the presence of another, the sound of a voice, the steady touch of a hand, worked a kind of healing deeper than herbs alone could give. The villagers knew the limits of their remedies. They had seen herbs fail, seen prayers unanswered, seen life slip away despite every effort. Yet they continued to gather, to brew, to offer, for even when cures could not be promised, comfort could. A child with a cough might fall asleep at last after a warm drink, and a mother's hand smoothing hair from a damp forehead. An elder with aching joints might find ease in a poultice of comfrey, tied carefully with cloth. A woman, exhausted from childbirth, might draw strength from a broth rich with garlic and leeks, her weakness met with nourishment and care. Healing was rarely absolute, but it was always attempted, and in the attempt lay a form of hope that kept despair at bay. In the village, certain women became known for their skill. Though they carried no title but that of neighbor, midwife, or wise woman, their knowledge gave them quiet authority. People came to them in secret at times, knocking on cottage doors late at night, asking for herbs to soothe pains too personal to name. They carried both respect and suspicion, for in a world shaped by faith and fear, the line between healer and sorceress was thin. A woman who could bring comfort might also be accused of wielding powers beyond the natural. Yet in the balance of daily life, gratitude often outweighed suspicion, for without these women, illness would have been a harsher companion. The herbs themselves carried stories, each plant known not only for its use but for its lore. St. John's wort, with its bright yellow petals, was said to drive away evil spirits. Sage was thought to bring wisdom and long life. Elder, with its clusters of white blossoms, was believed to hold both healing and danger. Its branches never cut without a word of apology to the spirit, said to dwell within. Villagers did not separate the practical from the mystical. A tea might soothe the stomach, but a charm whispered over it might soothe the soul. healing was never only physical. It touched the unseen as well, binding body and spirit together. Children grew up surrounded by this mingling of knowledge and belief. They learned to recognize the plants by sight and by scent, to gather gently, to respect the balance of taking only what was needed. They heard stories of ancestors healed by certain herbs, of dangers avoided by timely remedies. They learned that care was not only in the plants, but in the act of preparing them, in the time spent by the bedside, in the sharing of strength through presence. In this way, healing became not the work of specialists alone, but the shared language of the village, each family contributing in their way to the resilience of the whole. The rhythm of the seasons shaped healing just as it shaped farming. Spring brought the first tender shoots, nettles and dandelions, rich in green vitality. Summer offered abundance, chamomile, mint, lavender, thyme. Autumn gave roots and seeds, gathered and stored for the cold months ahead. Winter was the season of reliance, when dried bundles hung from rafters were called upon to brew teas, to flavor broths, to cleanse the air of sikrums, heavy with smoke and breath. Each season carried its gifts, and each was woven into the cycle of care. The healer's basket was never empty, only changed by the turning of the year. In the long nights of winter, when coughs echoed through cottages and fevers rose, the sound of someone knocking at the healer's door was familiar. She would stir from her bed, light a small lamp, wrap a cloak around her shoulders, and set out across frosted ground. Entering another's cottage, she became part of the family's struggle. Kneeling by the hearth, preparing herbs with practiced hands, her presence was both ordinary and extraordinary. A reminder that though illness separated the sick from the healthy, compassion bridged the gap. In her work, the village's bond was renewed, for healing was never solitary but communal, shared among those who refused to abandon one another. Thus, in the small cottages of medieval villages, healing was less about triumph over sickness than about endurance through it. Herbs softened pain, teas calmed restless nights, poultices drew out heat, but it was the hands that prepared them, the voices that reassured, the watchful presence through the night that made the deepest difference. Medicine was limited, but care was abundant, and in that abundance lay the true strength of the village. Illness came often, but so too did the gestures of comfort. And though cures were uncertain, the act of caring, the warmth of a hand, the sharing of tea, the steady patience of one who would not leave was itself a healing, as essential as any herb gathered from meadow or wood. In a medieval village, few sounds carried as much weight or as much meaning as the tolling of a bell. It was a sound that threaded through the lives of the people, shaping their days, marking their hours, and binding them to one another in times of both joy and grief. The church bell, suspended high in its wooden frame, was more than an instrument of metal and rope. It was a voice for the community, a voice that spoke without words, and one that all could understand. In ordinary times, its notes drifted over fields and cottages with familiar rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer, reminding shepherds of the passing hours, and anchoring the scattered routines of village life. But in seasons of illness, when fevers spread and lives faltered, the sound of the bell deepened into something heavier, more solemn, and more urgent. It became a signal of warning, of mourning, and of comfort, all at once. Each toll reminded the villagers that life was fragile, yet still measured, and that even in hardship the hours continued, each one part of a greater rhythm that endured beyond the span of individual lives. The ringing of the bell was heard by everyone, regardless of where they stood or what task they held in hand. A ploughman bent over his furrows would pause to lift his head, wiping earth from his brow as the sound carried faint but clear across the open land. A woman stirring a pot at the hearth might still her hand, listening to the vibration that seemed to echo even within the beams of the cottage. Children playing at the edge of the stream would stop their laughter, growing suddenly quiet as they counted each slow strike. The bell was not just heard but felt, its resonance lingering in the chest and the bones, a vibration that made each person, whether alone or among others, aware of being part of something larger than themselves. In the bell's sound, solitude was softened by belonging. Every village understood the language of bells. A quick, lively peal might celebrate a marriage or the christening of a child, its rhythm carrying joy into every corner. A steady toll might call the faithful to daily prayer, the summons not demanding but guiding, drawing the scattered lives of farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen toward the chapel. But when illness stalked the land, the tone changed. The bell became slower, deeper. Its intervals stretched so that each strike seemed to carry the weight of sorrow. Villagers did not need words to know what was meant. The sound itself carried the message. Another life had ended. Another household was in mourning. Another thread in the fabric of the community had been cut. The bell thus wove together the experience of individuals into a shared awareness. A family grieving alone in their cottage might feel, when the bell rang, that their sorrow was acknowledged by all. They were not left to suffer in silence, for the sound carried their burden into the air, announcing it across fields and streams, through woods and meadows. Every ear that heard the toll took in a portion of the weight. In this way, grief was made communal. The bell became a bridge between the private and the public, between the particular and the collective, reminding villagers that loss was not theirs alone, but part of a larger human story, one that all shared. During epidemics, when illness spread swiftly and fear darkened every path, the sound of bells was constant. They rang so often that the villagers learned to distinguish not only between joy and sorrow, but between the shades of sorrow itself. A bell for a child had a higher, lighter tone, striking more quickly, almost tenderly, as if the very sound was shortened to match the brevity of life. A bell for an elder was deeper, slower, a measured farewell for a long passage completed. When many died at once, the bells tolled repeatedly, overlapping with only brief silences between. The villagers lived in a landscape where the rhythm of bells became the rhythm of grief, marking not only the passage of hours, but the passage of lives. Yet even in this, the bells gave a kind of comfort. Their sound, solemn though it was, reminded the living that their sorrow was not solitary. When one household lost a father, another lost a child, another a neighbor. The bell wove these separate griefs into a fabric of shared endurance. No one sat alone in their pain, for all were gathered under the same sound, all carried by the same slow tolling. In the darkest days, when illness spread unchecked and hope seemed faint, the bell still rang, steady and unwavering. Its very constancy was a reassurance, though lives faltered. The rhythm of time continued, the voice of the community endured. The villagers came to trust the bell as they trusted the turning of the seasons or the rising of the sun. It measured not only their days but their sorrows, shaping their memories of events. A child grown old might remember not only the loss of a mother but the sound of the bell that marked her passing, its tone etched into the memory as deeply as the grief itself. In this way, the bell was both a marker of time and a keeper of memory, holding in its echoes the history of the community. Generations could pass, but the sound remained unchanged, linking the present to the past with each strike. The bell was also tied to faith. Each toll reminded villagers of the nearness of the chapel, the presence of prayer, the call to lift eyes and hearts beyond earthly troubles. When illness threatened, the sound was both warning and prayer, urging repentance, urging hope. To hear the bell was to be reminded that life was not only fragile but sacred, that every hour marked by its voice was a gift, and that every passing soul was commended to something greater than the village itself. In this way, the bell carried a double weight. It was both earthly measure and heavenly summons, both reminder of mortality and promise of continuity. Children grew up learning this language of bells almost instinctively. They did not need to be told what each pattern meant. They absorbed it from the rhythm of village life. A child running in a meadow might stop when the tolling began, whispering a name to a playmate, knowing without explanation who had died. They grew accustomed to hearing the bell and folding its sound into their understanding of the world, so that even at a young age they recognized the balance of joy and sorrow, of beginnings and endings. The bell thus educated as much as it comforted, teaching not through words but through the steady cadence of sound that reached all ears equally. The bell tower itself became a symbol of endurance. Standing above the village, it was visible from fields and paths, a constant presence against the sky. Even when illness kept villagers confined, they could look out from a cottage door and see the tower rising above rooftops, knowing that within it the bell hung ready to sound. It was a guardian of sorts, its silence pregnant with possibility, its ringing a reminder of the rhythms that bound all lives together. In storms, in droughts, in long winters, the tower stood, and the bell within waited to speak, as faithful as the cycle of day and night. For those tasked with ringing the bell, the duty was both an honor and a burden. To climb the steps of the tower, to grasp the rough rope, to feel the weight of metal moving with each pull, was to take part in the voice of the community. The ringer carried messages not of his own choosing but of the village's life, announcing births, deaths, gatherings, dangers. During epidemics, when the rope was pulled again and again, the ringer bore the sorrow of repetition, his arms aching, his ears filled with the sound of loss. Yet he also knew that without the bell, the community would be mute, each family isolated in their grief. The ringer thus bore his burden with quiet endurance, knowing his labor stitched the village together. In this way, the language of bells became not only a practical tool, but a form of resilience. The villagers leaned on its sound as they leaned on one another, finding in it both reminder and reassurance. The bell did not cure illness, nor could it prevent loss, but it gave shape to what might otherwise have felt like chaos. In the midst of uncertainty, it offered pattern. In the midst of silence, it offered voice. Its tones drifted across fields and cottages, solemn yet steady, reminding all who heard that life, though fragile, was not lived in isolation. Each toll bound the community together, and each silence between tolls gave space for breath, for memory, for endurance. Thus, in the medieval village, the bell was more than an object of bronze and wood. It was the heartbeat of the community, steady even when human hearts faltered. It was the language of time, of faith, of memory, of grief and hope intertwined. And in the darkest hours, when illness lay heavy and the future seemed uncertain, the sound of the bell carried over the land, telling all who heard it that though lives might be brief, the rhythm of the community endured, and no one was ever truly alone in their hardship. In the heart of many medieval villages stood the well, a simple circle of stone with a rope, a bucket, and a wooden beam stretched across its mouth. To the casual eye, it was only a hole in the ground, dug deep to find the hidden stream below. But for the people of the village, it was far more than that. The well was life itself, the artery through which the most basic necessity flowed, the point around which community gathered, and the quiet reassurance that even in times of trial, something steady and dependable remained. Each morning and evening, the sound of creaking rope and splashing water marked the rhythm of survival. As familiar as the crow of the rooster or the tolling of the church bell, the well was not only a place to draw water, but a place to meet, to exchange words, to measure the days, and to feel the shared pulse of life that bound the villagers together. Approaching the well was part of the daily ritual of countless households. Women carried earthen jars or wooden pails, their hands red from the morning's cold, their aprons lifted against the breeze. Children skipped beside them, eager to peer into the depths, to hear the echo of a dropped pebble dancing its way into darkness before the splash. Old men came slowly, leaning on staffs, their steps careful, their breaths short, but still determined to take part in this common task. The path to the well was worn with use, the earth pressed flat by generations of feet, so that even in times when the grass grew high in the meadows or the fields lay untended, the track to the well remained visible, carved by necessity and habit alike. The well itself, with its low stone wall and wooden frame, bore the marks of age. Moss clung to its outer stones, cool and damp to the touch. The rope, rough with wear, carried the faint scent of hemp and water, its fibers darkened from years of use. The bucket, patched in places with iron bands, knocked gently against the stone lip as it was lowered, a sound so ordinary it barely registered to those who heard it daily. And yet, for all its simplicity, the well was regarded with a quiet respect, almost reverence, for to it the village owed its very survival. In a world where rivers could freeze in winter, streams could dry in summer, and rain could fail to fall, the well stood as a constant, an assurance that life's most essential need was within reach. Drawing water was never a solitary act. Even if only one person approached, others would inevitably be there, waiting with their vessels, sharing brief words or long silences, depending on the day. In times of health and ease, the well was lively with chatter. Women compared notes on bread rising at their hearths, on gardens sprouting in their plots, on the stubbornness of livestock or the sharpness of the winter wind. Children clung to skirts or ran about the clearing, their laughter rising above the steady rhythm of rope and pulley. Even men, though less often the carriers of water, found reasons to linger, leaning on the well's wall, speaking of harvests, of weather, of repairs to cottages or barns. In such moments, the well was the village square, the place where information flowed as freely as water, where gossip and news mingled, where bonds of kinship were strengthened with each passing word. But when illness spread, the atmosphere around the well changed. Voices grew quieter, bodies kept a careful distance, and exchanges were shorter, more cautious. Yet still the people came. However grave the sickness that haunted the air, no household could afford to abandon the task. The need for water was too great, too constant, too inescapable. And so, even when fear pressed heavily, the well remained a place of gathering. Though now the words exchanged were hushed and heavy. "How fares your son? Have you heard the bells today? Is the fever worse in the northern cottages?" These questions passed with the same inevitability as the buckets, each rising from the depths with its splash, and each poured into waiting jars with careful hands. The act of drawing water became, in such times, an act of endurance, a sign that despite fear and loss, the necessities of life still bound the villagers together. The soundscape of the well was one that everyone carried in memory. The creak of rope as the bucket descended, the hollow thump as it struck the water, the sudden gurgle as it filled, and the rising splash as it was pulled back upward. These sounds spoke of continuity. To hear them was to know that life still followed its course, that no matter how uncertain the days, the deep earth still gave forth its hidden stream. A household that heard the bucket return, full and brimming, knew that meals could be cooked, floors scrubbed, mouths quenched, fevers cooled. The most ordinary sound became, in its own way, a promise. Water itself, once drawn, was treated with care. It was poured into pitchers of clay, cool to the touch, the droplets running down their sides to darken the floor beneath. Some were set by the hearth for cooking, some in basins for washing, some reserved for drinking. Every drop carried the weight of effort, the rope burn on palms, the ache in shoulders, the walk along the well-trodden path. Waste was unthinkable. Even children learned from the start that to spill water idly was to show disrespect, not only to the well, but to the labor of their kin. And so, the very act of drinking a cup raised two lips. A bowl shared between siblings carried with it a small sense of gratitude, a recognition that the simple taste of water was as precious as bread or fire. Beyond its physical necessity, the well also carried a symbolic weight. It was a reminder of shared survival, of dependence on the same hidden source. No matter how different households might be, some larger, some smaller, some wealthier, some poorer, relied upon the same rope, the same bucket, the same cold stream in the earth. In this, the well was the great equalizer, humbling and uniting in the same moment. A child of a prosperous farmer and a child of a laborer might both stand waiting for their mothers, playing side by side as the buckets rose and fell. In the eyes of the well, all thirsts were alike, all needs the same. There were also stories told of the well, for water, drawn from such hidden depths, carried with it mystery. Children were warned not to lean too far over, for spirits were said to live in the darkness, jealous of the light above. Some whispered of voices that could be heard if one listened at dusk, faint murmurs rising with the damp air. Others told of blessings, that the first water drawn on certain holy days carried special power, able to heal or to protect. Whether these tales were believed or not, they gave the well a character beyond stone and rope. It was not just a tool but a presence, something alive in its own quiet way, woven into the imagination of the people as much as into their routines. When a death struck the village, the well also bore witness. Those drawing water would speak of the loss, lowering their voices, shaking their heads, pouring sorrow into words as they poured water into jars. Sometimes, if a funeral was near, the well would stand momentarily still, the rope left hanging, the bucket swaying in silence as villagers walked past, dressed in darker clothes, bound for the chapel. The stillness of the well in such moments seemed to echo the stillness in the hearts of the people, as though even water itself paused to acknowledge the weight of grief. Through all seasons, the well endured. In summer, when the air was thick with dust and the fields baked beneath the sun, its water was cool relief, droplets clinging to the rim of cups, streaming down grateful throats. In winter, when snow crusted the cottages and the wind cut sharply through gaps in walls, the well's surface might stiffen with ice, but the bucket, broken through with steady persistence, would return full, a reminder that even in the hardest months, the deep earth gave forth its gift. Spring brought fresher taste, autumn a steadier flow, yet always the water remained, steady as the heartbeat of the land. The well, then, was not simply a source of water, it was a meeting ground, a witness to daily life, a quiet keeper of stories, and a symbol of endurance. In its simple, steady rhythm, It reminded villagers that survival was not a solitary act but a shared one, that every drop drawn connected one household to another, every bucket lifted bound the present to the past, and every sound of creaking rope and splashing water was a reassurance that, despite hardship, the essentials of life remained within reach. And so, long after the villagers who drew from it had passed, the well itself might still stand, moss clinging to its stones, rope frayed with age, bucket patched and repatched. Travelers stumbling upon it centuries later might see only a ruin, a circle of stone in an overgrown clearing. But if they listened closely, they might almost hear the echoes. The laughter of children waiting beside their mothers, the low murmur of voices sharing burdens, the creak of rope descending into darkness, the splash of water rising again. For the well was never only about water. It was about presence, about survival, about the unspoken bond that tied one life to another in the simplest of ways. And in that, it was as vital as breath itself, as enduring as memory, as essential as the land on which the village stood. Bread was the heart of survival. To understand the medieval village, one must begin with the loaf humbled round and browned from the heat of clay ovens that dotted backyards and communal spaces. If water was life, bread was endurance, the solid food that carried men through plowing, women through washing, and children through days of growth and play. Its very scent, drifting through narrow lanes and mingling with the smoke of hearth fires, gave comfort, even in seasons of scarcity, when the grains were coarse and the flour stretched thin with husks. Bread emerged from the oven as something more than food. It was reassurance that the rhythm of life continued, that families, no matter how strained, could break a crust together and know a measure of stability. In bread, there was survival, comfort, and a quiet dignity. The ovens themselves, often built of clay and stone, stood like silent guardians in corners of cottages or at the edge of village greens. Their rounded domes, blackened by years of fire, were shaped by the hands of the very people who relied on them. Each oven bore its own history, the cracks that spread across its surface, the soot that marked its arch, the faint warmth that lingered even when no flame burned. To step near an oven was to feel the pulse of work, the steady preparation that turned harvested grains into the food that bound the community together. In some villages, ovens were communal, and households waited their turn to bake, each bringing dough kneaded at home and returning with loaves stamped by familiar shapes or patterns to mark ownership. This waiting, this gathering by ovens, was a time of exchange as well, where words traveled as easily as warmth, and where bread became not only sustenance but also social glue. The making of bread began long before the oven. It began in the fields, where men bent their backs to sow seeds of barley, rye, or wheat, depending on soil and fortune. The harvest, gathered with sickles and bound into sheaves, carried the future of the village within it. Grain was threshed with flails, winnowed in the open air, ground into flour by hand or at the mill. Each stage was labor, but each stage was also anticipation, for all knew the end of this chain was bread. The flour, coarse and flecked with husk for the poorer, fine and white for the rare wealthy household, was kept in sacks or jars, guarded as carefully as coin. Women measured it with care, mixing it with water drawn from the well, a pinch of salt if available, and a leavening agent that gave rise to the dough. Sometimes it was a sourdough starter, passed from hand to hand, a living inheritance of yeast and time. Sometimes it was ale balm, the frothy remains from brewing beer, bubbling with potential. Whatever the source, it carried with it the invisible force that transformed plain flour into soft bread. Kneading was work in itself, a rhythm of pushing, folding, pressing, and turning that required both strength and patience. Women leaned into the dough, their arms dusted white, their aprons powdered with flour, as children watched or helped in small ways, pressing their tiny hands into the pliant surface. The sound of kneading filled cottages, a thump on wooden boards, a slap as dough was folded over itself. In those moments, the future loaf began to take shape, not only in substance but in spirit. It carried the imprint of hands, the quiet devotion of those who gave their energy to feed their kin. Waiting followed, the dough left beneath cloths to rise, swelling with the invisible work of yeast, softening, becoming ready. This waiting required trust, for in a world of uncertainty, even bread could fail. But more often than not, the dough rose, patient as the people themselves, responding to warmth, to time, to the steady traditions of generations. The firing of ovens was a ritual in its own right. wood carefully gathered from hedges or bought when scarce, was stacked within the clay dome and set alight. Flames licked the curved walls, filling the air with smoke and heat. Villagers watched the color of the oven carefully, for it was not clocks or thermometers that guided them, but the change of clay itself, the way soot burned away, leaving the surface clean and glowing with readiness. Once judged hot enough, the embers were raked aside or removed, and loaves, shaped and marked, were slid in with wooden paddles. The smell began almost immediately, first faint, then fuller, richer, until the entire space was wrapped in it, an aroma that promised sustenance. The crackle of crust formed as steam escaped, the loaves shifting slightly as they baked, expanding with a kind of quiet determination. When bread emerged, it did so with a presence that was both ordinary and sacred. Loaves were lifted out, golden brown or dark, some crusted with rough edges, others smoother, depending on the flour and the hand that shaped them. Families claimed their portions, wrapping them in cloth or carrying them openly, warm against their chests as they made their way home. Children often reached eagerly for the heel of a loaf, that first crisp piece broken off, its heat stinging their fingers before it soothed their hunger. The act of breaking bread was never simply about filling the stomach. It was about reassurance, about gathering at the table, about knowing that even in seasons of want, there was something to share. Bread also carried meaning beyond the household. To share a loaf with a neighbor was to declare solidarity. If one family found themselves short, another might quietly send over a portion, laid on a doorstep or offered with simple words. Such gestures mattered deeply, for they wove the invisible threads of trust that held the community together. Bread was also given to the poor, to travelers, to the sick, as a form of alms. In religious life, it was transformed into sacrament, the symbol of body and sacrifice, taken not just as nourishment, but as holiness. Thus, the loaf occupied both the mundane and the sacred, both daily hunger and eternal hope. The textures of bread spoke of status and circumstance. The wealthy might enjoy fine white loaves, their flour sifted carefully, soft to the touch and delicate on the tongue. The poor ate bread, darkened by rye, barley, or oats, coarse and filling, its crust hard and its crumb dense. Yet even the humblest bread carried value. In times of famine, when flour was stretched with chestnut flour, beans or acorns, people still baked, still pulled loaves from the fire. However bitter or heavy, bread, in any form, was better than none. And in its many textures and tastes, it told the story of the village itself, its fortunes, its hardships, its resilience. The act of eating bread was often accompanied by little else. Perhaps a smear of butter if cows had given enough milk, perhaps a slice of cheese, perhaps broth or stew if vegetables or meat were available. But often bread stood alone, cut into thick slices, dipped in water, or toasted by the fire. Its endurance lay in its simplicity. A family could survive on bread and little else for days, even weeks, if need be. And so the sight of a fresh loaf on the table was never taken for granted. It was a sign of continuity, of survival one more day. The sounds surrounding bread were part of village life. The crack of crust as loaves cooled, the gentle tap of knives cutting thick slices, the muffled hum of chewing at tables where words were few but presence was enough. The smell of bread, drifting from ovens, clinging to clothes, lingering in cottages, was perhaps the most comforting of all. It promised fullness, however modest, and warmth, however brief. Even when loaves burned or dough failed, the smell of bread never lost its hold on the senses. Bread shaped memory as well. Children grew up with the rhythm of kneading, the warmth of ovens, the taste of their mother's loaves. These memories stayed with them into adulthood, carrying the comfort of childhood into harder years. To bite into bread was to recall family, to recall care, to recall the shared endurance of all who labored to make it possible. And when elders passed, their recipes, their starters, their ways of shaping loaves became inheritance, carried forward into the next generation as surely as land or tools. Thus, bread was more than sustenance. It was presence, it was culture, it was the daily thread that bound villagers to one another, that wove households into a community that stretched across seasons and generations. In times of plenty, bread was celebration. In times of scarcity, it was endurance. In times of worship, it was holiness. And always, it was necessary, as essential as breath, as steady as the toll of the church bell. And so, when one thinks of the medieval village, it is impossible not to think of bread. Not the bread of banquet halls or feasts, but the bread of clay ovens, of coarse flour, of daily hands shaping and baking with quiet persistence. It was not glamorous, but it was vital. The crackle of crust, the warmth of the loaf, the nourishment within it, gave strength to face each day. And in this strength, the village endured, one loaf at a time, one meal at a time, one family at a time, carrying forward in the simplest yet most profound way possible, by breaking bread together. Even during epidemics, when fear lay heavy over the village like a low mist, children still played in courtyards, chasing one another, laughing, and inventing games from scraps of wood or stones scattered along the ground. Their laughter drifted softly through the air, piercing the silence that illness imposed upon homes and lanes. For parents, whose hearts were burdened by the worry of survival and the weight of uncertainty, these sounds of play were more than noise. They were reassurance, a reminder that life still pushed forward even when shadows pressed close. The sight of children running barefoot through dust or splashing their hands in puddles after rain gave them quiet strength. Joy persisted, fragile yet resilient, carried by the smallest members of the community. Childhood itself became light in the heaviest seasons, a lantern that burned even in the dark. The village, like many across the centuries, bore the marks of hardship. Plague, crop failure, sudden storms, and lean winters shaped the lives of all who lived within its narrow lanes and scattered fields. Adults faced these trials with stoicism, often silent endurance, for little choice remained to them. Yet within this fabric of endurance, children wove threads of play that softened the pattern. They turned courtyards, pastures, and even graveyards into places of movement and laughter. Where adults saw only risk or sorrow, children saw possibility. A length of rope became a game of skipping, a stick became a sword or a horse. A circle scratched in the dirt became a place for contests of pebbles or bones. Their inventiveness transformed scarcity into abundance, for they required little more than one another and the freedom of imagination to fashion joy. Parents, though anxious, often paused to watch these moments. From doorways or shaded corners, they would look upon their sons and daughters darting between walls, their voices rising in shouts and laughter, and feel a kind of temporary release. The sound of play carried them back to their own youth, reminding them that even they had once been shielded, however briefly, from the gravity of life by the gift of childhood. In such moments, gratitude stirred, even if fleetingly. The hardships of adulthood were eased by the knowledge that innocence still existed, that the world had not yet claimed all hearts with its burdens. The games themselves were simple but deeply rooted in tradition. Some were handed down through generations, their rules shifting little, their joy enduring. Boys might race each other across the green, their bare feet drumming against the earth. The race a contest of speed, but also a display of vitality. Girls might sing songs while clapping hands, their voices weaving together in rhythm, creating music that echoed softly against stone walls. Sometimes both joined together in circles, chanting rhymes whose origins no one remembered, spinning and collapsing into heaps of laughter. These games were not simply entertainment, but training in resilience, a quiet practice in social ties, trust, and companionship. Even in the shadow of sickness, when certain houses bore the sign of mourning, play did not cease entirely. Children might lower their voices, inventing quieter games of whisper and stealth, or they might cluster more closely in smaller groups. Yet the instinct to play remained. Illness created fear, but it could not silence curiosity or the need for joy. Parents sometimes scolded them, urging caution, reminding them not to stray near certain doors or touch certain belongings. But the resilience of youth pushed against these restraints. A hoop rolled along the lane, a chase erupted after it, and suddenly the boundary between fear and laughter blurred. In this way, children carried life itself forward, keeping it from stalling under the weight of grief. The toys they fashioned reflected the resourcefulness of their world. A carved bit of wood became a doll, with scraps of cloth tied for clothes. A bent branch might serve as a bow, launching small twigs into the air. Pebbles collected from the riverbank became treasures to be traded or counted. Bones from meals, cleaned and polished, turned into dice for games of chance. These objects held no monetary value, but in children's hands, they became prized possessions. They passed them from one to another, argued over them, celebrated them. In this exchange, lessons of ownership, sharing, and fairness emerged quietly. Adults, watching, recognized that such small objects carried weight far beyond their material worth. They sustained the imagination of their children, and in doing so, sustained hope itself. Seasonal rhythms also shaped play. In spring, fields not yet sown became arenas for running. In summer, rivers and streams became places of splashing contests, children wading in cool waters while parents worked nearby. Autumn brought games among fallen leaves, the crunch beneath their feet part of the joy. Winter, harsh and confining, pushed play indoors, where children huddled near hearths, carving, singing, or inventing stories to share. Each season demanded adaptation, but children met these shifts with eagerness, finding joy in whatever was at hand. Their ability to adapt reminded adults of the resilience required for survival, a lesson gently offered by the youngest among them. Play also held a spiritual dimension, though not always consciously. In villages deeply rooted in faith, the sound of children's laughter was often heard as a blessing, a sign that God's mercy had not abandoned them even in trials. Clergy might smile upon children chasing one another after services, seeing in their energy a kind of prayer. Parents, too, sometimes believed that as long as children played, the village itself retained a measure of divine favor. For this reason, their laughter carried more than amusement. It carried reassurance of life's continuity, of endurance granted by forces beyond their control. There were, of course, interruptions. A sudden wail might replace laughter when a child stumbled, skinning knees on rough stone. Tears followed, and parents hurried, lifting and soothing. Such moments reminded everyone of fragility, yet more often than not, the child soon returned to play, as if hardship itself were a game to be endured and overcome. Adults, watching, absorbed this lesson quietly, that resilience could follow pain, that joy could be reclaimed even after tears. In times of epidemic, the contrast between children's play and the silence of households marked by illness could be striking. One lane might echo with laughter, while another stood hushed, its doors closed, its windows darkened. This juxtaposition underscored the uncertainty of life, the precariousness of survival, yet it also highlighted the gift of each moment. Parents cherished the sound of their children all the more, knowing how fragile it was, how quickly it could be silenced. In this way, every game, every laugh, every chase became precious, remembered in times of sorrow as light remembered after nightfall. As children grew, their play shifted toward work, gradually blending responsibility with imagination. Boys who once swung sticks as swords began learning to guide plows. Girls who once cradled wooden dolls began helping to cradle real infants. Yet, within this transition, remnants of play lingered. A young shepherd might whistle tunes while guiding sheep, turning labor into a kind of game. A girl spinning wool might challenge herself with rhythm, transforming monotony into contest. These echoes of play within work reminded adults that childhood was not entirely left behind, but carried forward, softened into memory and habit. The legacy of play endured even into old age. Elders, sitting by hearths, often recounted their own childhood games to grandchildren, describing how they once ran barefoot, once carved toys, once sang songs whose melodies still lingered faintly in their minds. In these recollections, laughter returned, faint but real, connecting generations across time. The games of children, therefore, did not vanish with adulthood. They imprinted themselves upon memory, shaping character, offering comfort, and ensuring that joy was not lost even when life demanded endurance. Thus, play amid uncertainty was never trivial, it was vital. It reminded the community that hardship could not wholly silence life, that laughter could still rise against sorrow, that joy could be found even in courtyards overshadowed by fear. For parents, it was reassurance. For children, it was instinct. For the village, it was survival in another form, not survival of the body, but survival of the spirit. In the sound of children playing, there was continuity, resilience, and hope. And so, amid epidemics and trials, the village endured, carried forward, not only by the labor of adults, but by the laughter of its children, light shining softly in the darkest of days. Villagers measured survival not in days, but in seasons. Spring promised healing herbs, summer brought long hours of labor, autumn filled stores with grain, and winter tested endurance. Each season, though harsh, carried its own lessons and reassurances. The turning of the year reminded people that hardship, too, was part of a cycle that always moved forward. For those who lived in cottages of timber and thatch, beneath skies that could both nourish and punish, time was not counted by clocks but by the rhythm of nature's unfolding. Each season held its own voice, its own pace, and its own burdens, and the villagers, tethered to land and sky, moved with it. Spring arrived hesitantly, often carried on winds, still sharp with the memory of winter. Snow might linger in shaded ditches, while buds dared to open only slowly. Yet even the faintest green on hedges, the earliest primrose along a lane, stirred the spirit with promise. For villagers who had endured the darkness and scarcity of winter, spring was not merely a season but a reprieve. It carried healing herbs sprouting fresh on damp ground, nettles and dandelions that could be gathered for food, wild garlic that flavored soups and stews. Children were often sent out with baskets to collect these first gifts, their small fingers pulling leaves while the air filled with the damp, earthy scent of thawing soil. These gatherings were both necessity and ritual, a way of celebrating the return of life while also filling hungry bellies. The animals, too, responded to spring. Lambs stumbled beside their mothers in fields, their bleats carrying far into the morning air. Birds sang from hedgerows, returning to rebuild nests and fill the air with movement. Farmers took these sounds as signs of renewal, as proof that the earth still favored them with cycles of rebirth. Sowing began in earnest. Men walked fields with heavy steps, dropping seed into furrows, while women and children followed, scattering or covering them. Hope was planted alongside grain, hope that the months ahead would be kind, that storms would not come too soon, that pests would not descend in clouds. Spring, though gentle in appearance, was filled with labor and anxious watching, for its promise was fragile. Summer demanded more. It stretched days into long hours of light, and with that light came toil. Fields ripened under the sun, and villagers worked from dawn until evening shadows lengthened, gathering hay, tending crops, repairing what had been broken in winter. The air carried the scent of cut grass, the buzz of insects, the clatter of scythes and rakes. Sweat mixed with dust, staining hands and faces. Yet alongside the hardship of labor came a kind of vitality. Summer was a season of abundance, a time when gardens swelled with beans, cabbages and herbs, when orchards hinted at fruit to come. Children joined in work, chasing crows from fields or carrying bundles of kindling. Their play was woven into labor, their laughter rising among the sounds of toil. In the evenings, when the air cooled, the community often gathered outdoors. Meals of bread, cheese, and ale were shared in open air, with stories told while the horizon glowed faintly. Summer carried not only work, but also fellowship. Weddings were often held then, when food was plentiful and journeys easier, when flowers decorated garlands and songs lingered into the night. Though life remained difficult, summer's abundance gave the illusion of ease, a sense that survival was not only possible, but assured. This illusion sustained villagers, even as storms sometimes swept fields or drought threatened to crack the soil. Autumn arrived as both culmination and warning. The fields, heavy with grain, demanded harvest. Entire households moved into fields, bending and lifting, binding sheaves, and piling wagons. The air smelled of ripening fruit, of apples pressed for cider, of smoke rising from early fires. The harvest was more than work, it was survival, measured and stored, granaries filled, and jars were sealed. Each sack of grain, each bundle of dried herbs, each salted cut of meat meant endurance against the months ahead. Children collected nuts from woodlands, their pockets heavy with acorns and hazel. Women dried apples on racks near hearths, their sweet scent mixing with smoke. Yet autumn also carried melancholy. The golden light slanted low, evenings grew colder, and the first hints of frost touched the grass. Villagers moved with urgency, knowing that what was not done by autumn's end might mean hunger later. The joy of abundance was always tempered by fear. Would it be enough? Would the stores hold against a winter of storms, of illness, of endless nights? The rhythm of autumn was both a celebration of plenty and a rehearsal of worry, for winter stood close behind. Winter tested everything. It arrived not only with snow and ice, but with silence. Fields that had once been green lay buried. Rivers slowed under frost. Work shifted indoors, to spinning, mending, carving, and tending hearths. Bread was baked with caution, for flour must last. Fires were watched carefully, each log of wood precious. The cold pressed through walls and doors, and families huddled close, their breath visible in the dim air of cottages. Winter was endurance, and endurance meant rationing, patience, and prayer. Songs sung by the hearth often held slower tones, chants and carols that reminded listeners of faith, of divine protection, of hope for spring's return. Illness often struck hardest in winter, when bodies weakened from lack of fresh food and spirits grew weary of darkness. Bells sometimes tolled in the frosted air, carrying sorrow through the village. Yet, even then, life pressed forward. Children, restless, played near fires, carving figures from wood scraps or whispering games in corners. Adults told stories, passing history through the dark months like a torch. Winter was hardship, but it was also memory. It bound families together in shared survival, teaching patience and reverence for the cycles that could not be broken. The villagers did not resent the seasons, though they often cursed storms or long frosts. Instead, they understood them as truths, as unchangeable measures of life. Each season demanded something different, and each offered something in return. Spring gave promise, summer gave labor and community, autumn gave abundance and anxiety, winter gave endurance and reflection. Together, they formed the rhythm by which lives were measured. No man or woman could escape it, and few wished to, for in the turning of seasons lay a kind of assurance that life, however difficult, was part of a pattern older than memory. Festivals marked these rhythms, binding faith to the calendar. Planting festivals in spring carried prayers for fertile fields. Summer fairs brought markets, music, and contests of strength. Autumn harvest feasts celebrated survival, tables laden with what had been gathered. Winter, though spare, carried Christmas and midwinter fires, a reminder that light still existed even in darkness. These rituals gave villagers not only moments of joy but also anchors, a sense of continuity that made hardship bearable. Through song, dance, and shared meals, they reaffirmed their place within the great wheel of the year. In quiet moments, individuals often reflected on this rhythm. A mother, kneeling to gather herbs in spring, might think of her own childhood doing the same, and realize that her daughter, watching, would one day repeat it. An old man, sitting by the fire in winter, might recall summers of endless toil and realize how many cycles he had endured. These personal reflections gave meaning to hardship, shaping it not as senseless struggle, but as participation in something enduring. To live through seasons was to live in step with countless generations before, and countless yet to come. Thus, survival was not counted in days or weeks, but in the turning of seasons. Days might blur into one another, filled with repetition and labor, but seasons gave structure, gave memory. They taught patience, resilience, gratitude, and humility. The villagers did not ask for ease, for they knew it would not come. Instead, they asked for balance, enough sun to ripen fields, enough rain to nourish crops, enough wood to warm homes, enough grain to last. They prayed not for the absence of hardship, but for the strength to move through it, season by season, knowing that each winter yielded to spring, each hardship yielded to renewal. In this way, the rhythm of the seasons became not only the measure of survival, but the very heartbeat of village life. Every field, every hearth, every hand bore its mark, and so, through cycles of promise, labor, abundance, and endurance, the villagers lived, carrying forward the quiet assurance that time itself would not abandon them. That life, however fragile, always moved forward. Narrow dirt paths connected cottages, fields, and the church. These paths grew worn by countless footsteps. Even during epidemics, villagers walked them carefully, sometimes carrying baskets of food to neighbors or herbs to the ill. Each path was a lifeline, binding the community together, showing that connection continued despite fear. The grooves pressed into the earth by shoes, clogs, and bare feet became the silent record of lives lived in close proximity, of movements repeated so many times that the land itself carried memory. The paths were not planned with ruler or map. They grew as naturally as ivy, formed by need, by habit, by the instinct to reach one another. To the villagers, these lines of trodden soil were not merely convenient routes. They were veins through which the pulse of daily life continued to flow. Each morning, long before the sun reached its full height, figures moved along the paths. Women carried baskets laden with bread, herbs, or small jars of ale, their aprons swinging as they walked. Men passed with tools slung over shoulders, their steps steady and purposeful as they made their way to fields. Children, too, darted along these routes, sometimes sent on errands, sometimes merely running with joy. their shouts echoing in the mist. The earth grew hard where they walked most, and in wet weather the ground turned to slick mud. Yet still the paths remained, for nothing, neither rain, nor frost, nor the shadow of illness could erase the need for movement. During epidemics, when fear weighed heavily and people hesitated to linger in company, the paths became even more important. They allowed connection without gathering, a way to send what was needed while still keeping distance. A woman might leave a basket of herbs at the edge of a neighbor's garden, retreating quietly before the door opened. A child might carry a message down the winding lane and shout it from the hedge, avoiding close approach. The paths thus became channels of both caution and care. Even in silence, they carried meaning. Footsteps pressed into damp soil reminded villagers that others still lived, still reached outward, still shared what little they had. In times of sickness, the paths also carried sorrow. Men bearing a simple bier walked slowly toward the churchyard, the weight of their burden sinking into the earth beneath each step. Others followed at a distance, heads bowed, their voices hushed, as if the trees lining the way were listening. Over time, the ground near the church grew especially worn, for it received not only the living but also the departed. Yet, even in grief, the paths affirmed community. No one was carried alone. No one was left without witness. The lines of movement, from home to church, from cottage to field, told a story of continuity, of presence through hardship. Children often played along these same tracks. When danger lessened, they carved sticks into makeshift swords, chasing one another in laughter. Their games marked the paths with lighter impressions, mingling innocence with history. Sometimes, when summer air grew heavy, children stretched on the grass beside the worn lines, looking up at clouds while ants moved across the trodden earth. To them, the paths were not only practical but magical, places of discovery where a lost coin, a dropped button, or a curious stone might appear. Thus, joy mingled with labor, and laughter followed grief, each leaving its trace in the soil. Over years, the paths deepened, edges crumbling into soft banks where wildflowers grew, nettles clustered at corners, and blackberries tangled where hedges bordered the lanes. In spring, violets pushed through. In autumn, leaves scattered and collected. The earth bore seasons visibly, and the villagers learned to read the ground almost as they read the sky. A path widened here showed that neighbors often lingered to speak. A sharper turn there suggested someone's shortcut, carved through necessity, where a stone step had been laid. One could guess at kindness and effort to make the way easier for those who carried heavy loads. Every line was a record of lives intersecting, of care given and received. For those who labored daily, the paths were more than routes of necessity. They were companions. A shepherd, walking his flock toward pasture, knew each bend, each root rising across the ground. His stick tapped rhythmically as he passed, and sometimes he muttered softly, as though the path itself listened. Women returning from the well shared news as they walked side by side, their voices weaving into the hum of bees and the call of birds. Lovers met at crossroads, speaking quietly in the dusk. The paths bore secrets as well as necessities, carrying the weight of words spoken in trust, in hope, in fear. When storms came, the paths changed character. Heavy rains gouged gullies, rushing water cutting deep lines. In winter, snow covered them, and villagers followed memory more than sight, stamping prints into the white until the way was revealed again. Even in such times, the need for movement endured. The church bell still rang for prayers. The field still called for labor. Neighbors still relied upon one another. Thus, the paths, though altered by weather, remained constant in purpose. They symbolized not only geography but resilience, the determination to continue walking, no matter the state of the ground beneath. Travelers from beyond the village sometimes remarked upon these narrow tracks, surprised at their persistence. Unlike great roads of stone or wide cartways, these were modest, intimate, shaped by human need rather than design. Yet to the villagers, their value was profound. They were familiar in a way that great roads could never be. Every turn, every dip, every leaning tree was known, held in memory as securely as the faces of neighbors. To step onto such a path was to step into a continuity older than oneself, a rhythm of movement sustained by generations. The paths also carried faith. On Sundays, families walked them together, children skipping ahead, elders moving slowly behind. The sound of shoes on earth, the murmur of voices, the sight of neighbors converging, all gathered into a procession that led unfailingly to the church door. these repeated journeys wove devotion into the soil itself. Even during times of fear, when some hesitated to join worship, the paths leading to the church remained symbols of unity. Reminders that faith, too, traveled by foot, one step at a time. Stories often clung to particular places along the paths. A certain bend where a great oak leaned might be said to shelter spirits. A hollow where water gathered in spring could be called a healing pool. Children passed these stories along as they walked, their imaginations shaping the landscape into something more than soil and stone. In this way, the paths were not only practical but storied, carrying layers of meaning, memory, and myth. To walk them was to walk through history, through tales whispered by elders, through events both sorrowful and joyous. At times, villagers noticed the footprints left behind. In soft mud, the shape of a child's bare foot, the mark of a cartwheel, the press of a heavy boot told its own story. Parents could guess where children had wandered. Neighbors could know who had visited. These imprints faded quickly with weather, yet for a moment they were records, proof of presence and movement. The earth was a book briefly open, written in steps. Even when rain washed them away, the knowledge lingered. Others had passed here. Others shared the same need, the same connection. As years turned to decades, the paths rarely disappeared. Even if cottages fell or families moved, the ground remembered. Grass might grow, but beneath it the soil remained pressed, ready to reveal itself when walked again. Travelers centuries later could sometimes still find these ancient lines, their faint depressions winding through fields now altered. In this way, the paths became a legacy, a silent inheritance passed from generation to generation. A map of community carved not in ink or parchment, but in earth. To walk these paths was to participate in something larger than oneself. Each step echoed those who had walked before. Each turn carried memory. Each meeting place held unspoken history. They were humble, fragile, easily overlooked compared to grander roads, yet their meaning was profound. They were lifelines of community, shaped by countless journeys of care, necessity, sorrow, and joy. Even in the harshest times, even when fear shadowed the village, the paths endured. And as long as feet pressed into soil, as long as neighbors continued to walk, the lines would remain, testaments to connection that no hardship could erase. At night, candles glowed in cottage windows. Their faint light was visible from paths, a signal that life remained inside. To passers-by, those glimmers were reassuring, a quiet sign of resilience. Even a single flame could brighten the heavy stillness of epidemic nights. In times when darkness felt overwhelming, the flicker of a candle became more than a practical tool. It was a message of endurance, a reminder that breath, warmth, and hope lingered behind thin walls of timber and plaster. The glow from windows did not erase hardship, yet it softened the silence, offering comfort to those who passed and proof that the village still lived. Night in the village carried a stillness that pressed heavily on the senses. Fields lay hushed, their crops hidden in shadow, the outlines of hedges barely visible against the pale light of the moon. Roofs blended into the dark sky, and only the faint shapes of chimneys gave structure to the horizon. In such enveloping quiet, the appearance of a candle flame in a window drew the eye with magnetic force. Its glow spilled outward in small triangles of light, stretching onto dirt paths or catching the edges of stone walls. Villagers accustomed to hardship knew the sight well, and though it was ordinary, it stirred something deep, reassurance that their neighbors, though distant, shared the same night, the same fears, and the same determination to endure. Candles themselves were precious. Tallow, the most common material, was made by melting animal fat, pouring it into molds, or dipping wicks again and again until a usable taper formed. Their smell was often acrid, and the smoke left streaks along cottage ceilings, yet they gave light enough to gather by. Wealthier households sometimes had beeswax candles, smoother, cleaner burning, with a sweetness in their scent. But whether of fat or wax, every candle represented work, material, and cost. To light one was not thoughtless. It meant deciding that visibility, comfort, or prayer mattered enough to spend what could otherwise be saved. And so, the candles that burned in windows were never random. They were small acts of choice, declarations of presence set against the night. Within cottages, the light of a candle softened hardship. Shadows stretched across timber beams, flickered over the faces of children curled beneath blankets, caught on the curve of a jug or the grain of a wooden table. Families gathered close around the glow, speaking in hushed tones, mending clothes, or praying quietly. In such hours, when fear of illness crept most strongly into thought, the flame was both companion and protector. Parents watched its steady burn with relief, for it gave their children reassurance. Elders saw in it a symbol of continuity, linking their own watchful nights to countless generations who had done the same. From outside, a traveler moving down a worn path could look across the village and see scattered lights, each one a point in a constellation of survival. Where no light shone, the silence felt heavier, a reminder of absence or of fear too great to kindle flame. But where a glow remained, the traveler's heart lifted slightly. It meant someone still stirred within. Someone still lived to keep watch. Even if unseen, the presence of another human soul reached outward through the window pane, carried by the gentle movement of fire. The candlelight also held symbolic weight during epidemics. Some believed the flame kept sickness at bay, its purity pushing back the unseen corruption of air. Others set candles in windows as signs of prayer, offerings for divine protection, or gestures of remembrance for those already gone. A single flame could thus embody both grief and hope, mourning what had been lost, while refusing to surrender to despair. These dual meanings wove together in silence, making each glow on the dark lanes a layered message, understood differently by every observer, yet shared by all. Children, especially, found comfort in candlelight. Fearful of shadows and silence, they often asked their parents not to snuff the wick too soon. They watched the flame dance, seeing shapes in its movement, tiny figures leaping, sparks of gold reaching upward. To them, the flame seemed alive, a friend against the unknown. Parents, though mindful of tallow's cost, often relented, understanding that the small security of light was worth the sacrifice. And so, in many homes, candles burned longer than practical needs required, prolonging the sense of safety deep into the night. Neighbors sometimes looked for one another's lights as unspoken reassurance. A woman glancing from her doorway could see across the lane a faint glow in another cottage, and she would breathe easier. They are still there, she might think, still watching, still holding on. If a window that once glowed remained dark for several nights, worry spread quietly, and someone would walk the path in daylight to inquire. Thus, the candle became not only a private comfort, but a communal sign, part of the unspoken language by which villagers gauged the well-being of their community. In times of mourning, candles carried special weight. After a death, families often placed a taper in the window to honor the departed. Its light shone outward as a quiet proclamation that a soul had left but was not forgotten. Neighbors, seeing the glow, understood without words and held the family in thought. Sometimes, multiple homes lit candles in solidarity, scattering the night with a field of tiny flames, each one a prayer that grief be lessened by shared compassion. In such ways, the candlelight transformed from simple utility into ritual, binding the village together in both loss and resilience. The physical presence of the flame brought subtle changes to how people perceived their surroundings. In the candle's limited circle of glow, the ordinary became almost sacred. A loaf of bread on the table, a jug of water, the face of a loved one appeared, softened, framed by shadow, elevated into quiet significance. Hardship made these moments more poignant, for by candlelight the simplest possessions seemed to carry more weight, more gratitude. Villagers remembered these sights long after, describing them in tones of reverence, as though light itself had blessed the memory. Seasons shaped the meaning of candlelight too. In summer, nights were shorter, and candles burned briefly before dawn returned. But in winter, when darkness lingered for long hours and frost clung to the earth, their glow was essential. Windows brightened early. Flames carried families through long evenings when winds howled and illness pressed hardest. The sight of such light in deep winter held particular power. It suggested warmth, shelter, and survival at a time when cold and hunger threatened most strongly. Even those who lacked much could kindle a small flame, and in that act affirm life against the season's harshness. Stories grew around candlelight. Some villagers believed the flame in a window could guide lost souls, both living and departed, back toward safety. A traveler caught in fog might look for the glow as a landmark, knowing it meant hearth and welcome nearby. Folktales told of spirits drawn to light, lingering outside windows but unable to cross the threshold. Children whispered such tales with wide eyes, half fearful, half reassured that the candle's glow kept dangers at bay. Thus, imagination intertwined with necessity, and the simple act of placing a flame in glass became both protective charm and guiding star. In the deepest nights, when silence stretched and even dogs ceased to bark, a single candle could transform the mood of an entire lane. Its light reflected faintly on puddles, glimmered on frost, or sent narrow beams through swaying branches. Those walking home from late labor or tending to a sick neighbor carried the memory of these lights with them, comforted by their presence. More than once, villagers later recalled that it was not words or gifts that gave them strength in such times, but the sight of a steady glow in the distance, proof that they were not alone. Over years, as families changed and epidemics passed, the practice of placing candles in windows endured. It became tradition even in calmer times, a habit rooted in memory of hardship but carried forward as quiet ritual. Generations later, villagers would still kindle lights at dusk, not always thinking of survival, but of connection, of continuity with ancestors who had done the same. The glow of candlelight thus carried history within it, a living memory passed flame to flame, wick to wick, across time. And so, the candlelight in windows was never only illumination, it was presence, it was resilience, it was the silent language of survival whispered across lanes, over fields, through winters, and during nights heavy with fear. Each flame, though small, joined a larger constellation, shaping the village into a place of endurance and solidarity. To walk those paths at night and see windows glowing was to feel less burdened, less solitary, more certain that, despite all hardship, life continued within. In the quietest of times, when hope felt fragile, the candlelight reminded them that even a small flame could keep darkness at bay. Music softened sorrow. Families sang ballads by the hearth or hummed prayers before sleep. Simple melodies, low and repetitive, brought calm. Songs carried memory, weaving the past into the present, and reminded villagers that even in hardship, beauty endured, though their voices were untrained and the tunes sometimes uneven. The act of singing bound people together, filling small cottages with warmth that fire alone could not provide. The sound of music, however humble, reached beyond necessity. It spoke to resilience, to the need for comfort, and to the enduring power of rhythm to soothe human hearts. Evenings in the village arrived with slow predictability. The last chores were finished, animals secured in pens, tools leaned against walls, smoke drifted from chimneys as suppers of bread, pottage, or roasted roots were shared. After food came silence, an hour when darkness pressed close and fears of illness or hunger sharpened. It was in this pause that song often emerged, not with grand announcement, but with gentle persistence. A father might hum a line as he patched a net, a mother follow with words half remembered, and children soon joined until a modest harmony filled the air. The sound transformed the atmosphere, softening the weight of night. The songs themselves were rarely written down. They lived in memory, passed from one voice to another, altered slightly with each telling. A ballad known to grandparents might differ in detail by the time grandchildren sang it, yet its heart remained constant. These tunes carried fragments of history, tales of past harvests, of wandering lovers, of saints and their miracles. Villagers treasured them because they were both familiar and flexible, able to fit the mood of any evening. In times of worry, verses about endurance were chosen. In lighter moments, playful songs or riddling rhymes filled the room with laughter. Children, in particular, absorbed songs quickly. Long before they could read, they knew melodies by heart, learning through repetition and imitation. To them, songs were not only entertainment, but education. They memorized the names of herbs through rhyming couplets, practiced counting with rhythm, and learned moral lessons woven into simple refrains. Parents knew that song imprinted knowledge more firmly than instruction alone, and so teaching often came wrapped in melody. In this way, the evening singing was as much preparation for life as it was comfort against sorrow. Some songs were prayers in disguise. Instead of formal Latin chants from the church, villagers sang in their own tongue, creating verses that spoke of fields, rain, and protection against unseen illness. These melodies rose with sincerity, even if their words lacked polish. They reminded singers that they were part of a greater whole. Their small voices carried upward with countless others. Whether or not divine ears listened, the act of lifting sound into the night created unity, giving a sense that hardship was shared, and perhaps lightened, by collective appeal. Neighbors sometimes heard each other's songs through thin walls or open shutters. A solitary tune drifting from one cottage might encourage another household to begin its own. Soon the lane seemed alive with scattered notes, some overlapping, some distinct, forming a patchwork of sound. Though uncoordinated, the effect was strangely harmonious, the village singing itself to rest. Those walking the paths at such times described the sensation of being surrounded by music, as though every step carried them through a web of resilience, spun by familiar voices. The instruments that accompanied these songs were modest but cherished: a simple flute carved from wood, a drum fashioned from stretched hide, or a stringed lute passed down through generations could lend rhythm to voices. Even the clapping of hands or tapping of spoons on wooden bowls provided percussion. Children delighted in these sounds, eager to join with improvised beats. Villagers cared little for perfection. What mattered was participation. A cracked lute or uneven drum did not diminish the meaning of music, it amplified it, showing that beauty could emerge even from humble tools. During epidemics, songs carried additional significance. When fear silenced laughter during the day, evenings became the only time when sound dared to rise above whispers. Families sang not to forget sorrow but to reshape it. A ballad about endurance in harsh winters became newly relevant when illness spread, reminding listeners that suffering was part of a cycle long endured by ancestors. In some households, special verses were added, calling for protection or remembering the names of the recently departed. Music thus became a form of record-keeping, inscribing the community's grief and hope into melody. The tone of evening songs varied with season. In spring, lively tunes celebrated planting and renewal. Children skipped about as parents sang. Summer evenings carried fuller sound, doors left open so neighbors might hear. Autumn songs often slowed, reflecting the weight of harvest labor, but also gratitude for abundance. Winter, however, gave the music deepest meaning. Long nights, biting cold, and the looming threat of sickness made song a form of survival. Around the hearth, families lifted voices against silence, each note a spark of warmth in the frostbitten dark. For many, the memory of song was as powerful as the music itself. A person who had lost a loved one might recall the sound of their voice joining in refrain. A child grown older carried into adulthood the echoes of lullabies sung at night. Even when melodies faded, their imprint lingered on invisible inheritance, reminding each generation of the voices that had once filled their homes. This continuity was especially precious in times of uncertainty. To sing a familiar song was to link oneself with parents, grandparents, and countless others who had endured hardship before. Travelers passing through villages noticed the sound of music as a mark of resilience. From outside, hearing a cluster of voices carried on the evening air suggested that life still thrived despite hardship. For weary strangers, the melodies invited both curiosity and comfort. Some described the experience of approaching a darkened settlement, expecting silence, only to hear faint strains of song drifting across fields. It was proof that the people within, though poor and anxious, still held on to beauty. To travelers, such sounds gave assurance that hospitality and humanity remained alive behind the doors they would soon knock upon. The rhythm of song also ordered time. In an age when clocks were scarce, the start of evening singing became an informal marker. Children knew that after the last song came bedtime. Adults felt that when the final verse ended, night had truly begun. Songs thus structured the hours, shaping routine not with bells or machines but with voices. The predictability of this rhythm reassured villagers, helping them anchor themselves against the uncertainties of illness and misfortune. Certain songs became deeply associated with particular families. A refrain sung by a grandmother might remain linked to her memory for decades, so that even after her passing, neighbors would say, "That was her song." When descendants continued singing it, they kept her presence alive, layering their voices onto hers in unseen continuity. In this way, song became a form of remembrance more personal than written record, fragile, yet enduring across generations through the simple act of repetition. The physical act of singing also brought relief. Breath drawn deeply, released in rhythm, calmed nerves and slowed racing thoughts. Even those who claimed no musical talent found that humming eased tension in their chests. Families noticed that after song, children fell asleep more peacefully, and elders seemed less troubled. In a time when medicine was scarce, music served as a kind of invisible remedy, easing mind and body in ways villagers could not fully explain, but instinctively trusted. At times, evening songs spilled beyond the cottage walls into gatherings. Neighbors would bring stools and sit together in a shared yard or near the church steps, their voices rising into the open night. These moments were rare during epidemics, Yet when they occurred, they carried immense significance. Collective singing gave shape to solidarity, turning individual sorrow into communal strength. Listeners often recalled these gatherings years later, describing them not in terms of skill, but of feeling the sensation of standing among voices and knowing that no hardship could erase their bond. Silence, when it followed song, carried its own meaning. The last note faded into the dark, leaving behind a stillness that felt less heavy than before. It was as though the village exhaled, unburdened for a moment by fear. Families settled into rest with hearts steadier, memories softened by melody. In the quiet that followed, the residue of song lingered, shaping dreams and tempering worry until morning light returned. Thus, the songs of the evening were never mere pastime. They were memory, ritual, medicine, and prayer. They stitched the hours of the night together, softened grief, and reminded villagers of their shared humanity. The melodies did not erase hardship, but gave it form, making suffering bearable through rhythm and harmony. In the glow of candlelight, voices rose, weaving beauty into darkness, carrying forward traditions that neither plague nor poverty could silence. Each song, however small, affirmed that life was more than toil and fear, that, even in the most uncertain times, the human spirit still reached for music. And so, the sound of evening songs became part of the village's identity. It was a language of endurance, an inheritance passed from throat to throat, from one generation to the next. Long after individual words were forgotten, the habit of singing remained, echoing across centuries in countless forms. What began as survival became tradition, and what comforted one family became memory for all. The songs of the evening, sung beside hearths and beneath rafters, reminded them that beauty endured not, despite hardship, but within it. Spinning wool, repairing tools, patching garments, these small labors filled the hours. Work was not only a necessity but comfort, anchoring minds in rhythm and usefulness. Hands moving steadily created a sense of order against the unpredictability of illness. The sound of a spindle worry or shears clipping cloth brought quiet reassurance. In times when fear spread more quickly than any sickness, these daily tasks were not distractions but lifelines. They gave shape to long hours, carrying villagers forward, one steady movement at a time. Each cottage, though humble, carried the rhythm of work within its walls. Women sat near hearths, their fingers pulling tufts of wool into threads, the spindle spinning with practiced ease. The sound was soft, yet constant, as steady as breath. Children, too young for heavier labor, often helped by carding wool, teasing fibers apart so they might be spun more smoothly. Their chatter accompanied the turning wheel, mixing sound and rhythm until work became music of its own kind. Repairing tools demanded a different kind of attention. Iron nails, wooden handles, and cracked pots found new life under careful hands. A farmer who could not mend his hoe risked losing his crop. A family with a broken pot might struggle to cook their meals. So evenings often included this quiet form of craftsmanship. Sparks flickered from a small hearth as metal was reshaped, while nearby children watched with wide eyes, learning through observation. Every repair carried reassurance. The world might fray, but it could also be mended. Clothing, too, bore marks of hands at work. Garments rarely came new. Most were inherited, shared, or pieced together from older cloth. Mothers and daughters patched sleeves, restitched hems, and turned worn collars to hide their fray. A single garment might pass through several generations, carrying traces of each one in its faded fabric. The act of patching was not only practical, but symbolic. The body was kept warm by layers of care. By the hours, a family invested in sustaining one another. Each stitch was both thread and devotion. The rhythm of work also gave structure to time. When illness disrupted normal patterns, hands at work provided steadiness. Morning might bring uncertainty. News of neighbors struck down. Yet by evening the spindle still turned, the thread still lengthened, the cloth still grew beneath patient hands. This persistence offered comfort, reminding villagers that while sickness could not be controlled, daily labor could. Through repetition, they reclaimed a small piece of order. Children grew into these rhythms gradually. At first, they helped with small, playful tasks, sorting beans, gathering twigs, or holding skeins of yarn for their mothers to wind. Over time, these tasks grew into skills. By the age of 10, most children could spin, mend, or carve in some capacity. Work was not forced but expected, and within its expectation lay belonging. A child who contributed, however modestly, felt anchored within the household, their small efforts woven into the larger fabric of family survival. Even in the shadow of epidemics, work gave villagers a sense of worth. To sit idle was to let fear creep in, but to sit with thread in hand, or wood beneath a blade, was to declare life ongoing. Elders in particular valued this. Though their bodies could no longer manage the heavy labor of fields, they remained vital by mending garments, shaping small tools, or passing on craft techniques. Their hands, slower but still skilled, kept them connected to usefulness, and with usefulness came dignity. The materials themselves carried meaning. Wool shorn from sheep was washed, carded, spun, and eventually woven into cloth. At each stage, hands shaped it, transforming raw fiber into warmth. Villagers knew the weight of each garment because they had built it piece by piece. Similarly, tools carved from local wood bore not only function but familiarity. A wooden spoon, worn smooth after years of stirring, was not a simple object but a testament to hours of care invested by unseen hands. The soundscape of labor filled cottages as much as voices or songs. The whir of a spindle wheel, the creak of a loom, the crackle of a hearth fire, and the soft hiss of a needle-piercing fabric. These were not noises to be ignored, but signals of life continuing. When silence threatened to grow heavy, the return of these sounds gave reassurance. Neighbors walking past cottages might hear the rhythm of weaving or the scrape of sharpening tools and feel comforted. Someone inside was working, and therefore enduring. Shared work often deepened bonds. Women sometimes gathered to spin together, their spindles turning as conversation flowed. Men mended fences side by side, trading advice and stories, while hammering nails into wood. These gatherings created more than efficiency. They wove companionship into the fabric of labor. To mend together was to share burdens. If one woman's husband fell ill, neighbors might help with her spinning. If one man broke a plow, others came with tools to repair it. Work thus became not only individual survival, but communal solidarity. Illness changed the texture of these gatherings, but did not eliminate them. At times, neighbors worked at separate ends of a yard, speaking across distance, but still sharing presence. The hum of spinning wheels carried reassurance even when touch or closeness was avoided. Such adaptations revealed the resilience of routine. Even when disrupted, it reformed itself, finding new shapes to continue. Villagers understood instinctively that to keep hands moving was to keep despair at bay. There was comfort in the tactile qualities of work. Fingers knew the feel of wool growing smoother as it was spun, the texture of wood shifting under the knife, the firmness of cloth pulled tight under a needle. These sensations grounded villagers in the present moment, drawing their minds away from distant worries. In a world without books or clocks for many, touch itself became a kind of anchor. Each material a reminder of human ability to shape, to mend, to persist. The passing of seasons influenced the nature of this labor. Winter was dominated by indoor tasks, spinning, weaving, mending. The long nights were filled with the quiet drone of spindle and wheel, the glow of hearthlight revealing bent backs and moving fingers. Spring shifted attention outward, mending tools for planting, shaping stakes for gardens, preparing baskets for gathering. Summer brought repairs in haste, as broken handles or torn garments demanded quick solutions. Autumn blended both. Outdoor repairs gave way to evenings of clothwork, as the nights lengthened once more. Stories often accompanied labor. Elders told tales as they spun, their words pacing the rhythm of the wheel. Parents recounted family histories while patching garments, embedding memory within fabric. Children asked questions, filling the hours with curiosity that made the work lighter. In this way, the act of labor carried meaning beyond productivity. It was a vessel for memory, knowledge, and connection, passed hand to hand, along with thread and tools. Not all tasks succeeded. Threads snapped, tools broke beyond repair, garments wore too thin for patching. These failures were reminders of life's fragility, yet they also taught resilience. A broken pot might be sealed with pitch, a tool repurposed for another function, a garment turned into rags or bedding. Nothing was wasted. Villagers learned that even when work did not restore as intended, it still yielded something. The lesson was simple. Imperfection was not defeat, but adaptation. The image of hands at work lingered in memory because it symbolized endurance. A mother spinning while her child coughed nearby. A father sharpening a blade, though harvest was uncertain. An elder stitching by dim candlelight all became quiet emblems of resilience. These acts did not stop sickness or guarantee survival, but they affirmed life. They declared, without words, that as long as hands could move, there was purpose, and with purpose came hope. In later years, when survivors looked back on the hardest seasons, they often remembered not only who was lost, but what was done to endure. They spoke of the endless spinning, the nights of stitching, the patient mending of broken tools. These memories carried pride, for they revealed that hardship had been met, not only with grief, but with determination. Work gave shape to their survival story, one stitch, one repair, one small rhythm at a time. Thus, the village endured through its hands. Spindles spun, needles stitched, hammers struck. Each movement, repeated across countless evenings, created a fabric of resilience that illness could not unravel. The sound of hands at work was more than labor, it was life persisting. Order restored, fear held at bay. In every patched garment, every mended tool, every thread pulled from wool, the villagers found proof that their world, though fragile, was still theirs to shape. And so, they kept working, hour after hour, stitch after stitch, until night itself seemed softened by the rhythm of their endurance. Night was long, and villagers often took turns keeping watch, listening for wolves, tending the fire, or simply ensuring safety. These watches built quiet trust within households. The stillness of night pressed close, but the small glow of a lamp and the steady breath of a watcher made the darkness less overwhelming. In a world without clocks, the hours of night stretched endlessly, measured not by numbers but by the slow passage of stars across the sky, by the creak of timbers in cottages, and by the steady crackle of a hearth that needed tending. For those who kept watch, the act was not only duty but devotion, a silent assurance to the sleeping household that someone remained awake, guarding them against dangers both real and imagined. The night held both fear and wonder. In the countryside, where no lanterns lined the roads and no distant cities threw their glow into the sky, darkness was absolute. Once the sun dipped beyond the horizon, the village seemed swallowed in shadow, with only the faint outlines of cottages against the dim starlight. Yet to those whose eyes adjusted, the night revealed its own textures, the pale light of the moon slipping across thatched roofs, the silver gleam of frost forming on fences, the shifting patterns of clouds against the heavens. To the watcher, these sights became familiar companions, markers that kept loneliness from overwhelming. A certain tree might cast its shadow in a particular shape, a certain star might rise at the same hour, and these constancies made the long hours less uncertain. The most pressing duty of night was protection from animals. Wolves still roamed the forests, their howls drifting across fields in the cold months when hunger made them bold. To hear such a cry while on watch was to feel one's spine stiffen and hand tighten around a staff or bow. Yet often, the howls remained far away, and the watcher's task was simply to stay alert, ready in case the pack drew closer. Not only wolves but foxes, stray dogs, or thieves might threaten the safety of livestock. And so, a watchful presence near barns and byres was as necessary as tending the fire inside the home. A cow or sheep lost in the night was not easily replaced. Thus, every rustle in the hedges, every creak of the wooden gate, was listened to carefully, weighed in the silence of the dark. Inside the cottages, the watch took on a gentler form. Fires could not be left untended, for a flame that died before dawn meant cold hearths and chilled sleepers. A watcher stirred embers with iron rods, added small pieces of wood, and banked the fire carefully to last until morning. The red glow cast flickering shadows across walls, giving the cottage a sense of quiet life, even when most within it dreamed. Sometimes the watcher sat with spindle or needle in hand, continuing work while others rested, the steady rhythm of labor softening the long wait. Other times, they simply sat still, listening to the breaths of children, the sighs of sleepers, and the creak of rafters overhead. These small sounds, amplified in the hush of night, reminded the watcher that the house was full of life, each breath dependent on the careful tending of the present moment. Trust was woven deeply into the act of keeping watch. To sleep in safety was to place faith in another's wakefulness. A father who stayed by the door with a staff gave his family confidence enough to close their eyes. A mother who sat near the hearth gave her children warmth and courage to dream. In larger households, the duty passed from one person to another, each taking a portion of the night. The rhythm of shared vigilance created a quiet bond. Even in slumber, the family was bound together by the presence of someone awake. ensuring that the fragile hours of darkness did not pass unguarded. The night also carried whispers of the unseen. Superstitions filled the hours, for when senses strained to catch every sound, the mind often imagined more than it perceived. A gust of wind might be thought a spirit passing, a flicker of shadow, a wandering soul. The watcher's courage lay not only in facing wolves or thieves, but in mastering their own imagination, steadying their mind against fears that arose from silence itself. Many whispered prayers during their watch, not aloud but inwardly, calling on saints or holy figures to guard their home as they themselves stood guard in flesh. In this way, the night watch became both physical and spiritual, a union of vigilance and devotion. Villagers understood the deep stillness of night differently than we might today. With no constant ticking of clocks, no lamps burning endlessly, time stretched in ways that felt almost unmeasurable. The stars wheeled slowly above, the moon changed shape across nights, and the silence seemed to lengthen endlessly before dawn. To those awake, this expanse of time demanded patience. Some watchers filled it by recalling stories, replaying memories, or composing simple songs in their minds. Others found themselves drifting into prayer, repeating familiar phrases until the words seemed to blend with the crackle of the fire or the rustle of trees outside. Night offered solitude rarely found in the busyness of daylight, and though this solitude carried fear, it also carried reflection. Communal life extended even into the darkness. Sometimes neighbors signaled one another with faint lights. A candle burning late in one window might reassure another watcher across the lane that someone else was awake, sharing the burden of the night. These glimmers across the village created a network of unspoken solidarity. Though each household stood apart, each watch connected them in subtle ways. If a wolf prowled near, the barking of one dog set off another, until the whole village seemed awake and aware. In this way, the night belonged not only to individuals but to the collective, the darkness linking them as surely as the paths they walked in daylight. Children, too, remembered the presence of watchers. Though they slept, they sometimes stirred and glimpsed the faint glow of a fire, or the shape of a parent sitting near. That image settled deeply into memory, the knowledge that someone was always awake, always watching, always tending. Years later, grown children recalled these memories with tenderness, recognizing that the watch of night had been an invisible gift, given without complaint or fanfare, but essential to their sense of safety. As the seasons shifted, so too did the nature of night watches. In summer, the hours of darkness were short, the air mild, and the duties lighter. But in winter, the night stretched long, and the cold demanded vigilance not only against animals but against frost itself. Water froze in buckets, ice crept across windows, and breath clouded in the air inside the cottage. The watcher's task then was heavier: to keep the fire alive, to ensure blankets remained tight around sleeping children, to guard against the numbing cold that crept in through cracks and gaps. Winter nights tested endurance, for weariness pressed hard, and yet the duty could not be abandoned. The faintest lapse might mean shivering dawns and weakened bodies, more vulnerable to illness. Illness itself made the night watch even more necessary. When coughs rattled through the household or fevers burned in restless bodies, someone always had to remain awake. Water was fetched, cloths dampened, herbs stirred into broth, prayers whispered above sweating brows. For families struck by sickness, the watch was no longer only about wolves or fires, it became about tending life itself, one breath at a time, ensuring that no fever raged unchecked, no sick child was left alone in the depth of night. In such hours, the watcher became a guardian not just of safety, but of survival. There was also a quiet intimacy in these hours. The rest of the household slept, unaware, while the watcher remained awake with their thoughts. In that solitude, they often reflected on life's fragility, on the cycles of day and night, on the uncertainties of illness and harvest. The watch offered a kind of enforced stillness, a pause in which the mind wandered freely. Many came to cherish this solitude, for though it was born of duty, it offered rare space for contemplation. Night's silence became a canvas for thought, and in that silence, small realizations often blossomed. At last, dawn would begin to loosen the grip of night. A faint paling of the sky appeared in the east. The first bird called out, and the air itself seemed to shift. For the watcher, this moment carried relief. The long hours had been endured, and the household could soon stir to light and warmth. Yet there was also quiet pride in the endurance itself. To have kept the fire alive, to have guarded the sleepers, to efface the shadows without faltering. These were small but vital triumphs. Each night that passed safely was a thread woven into the larger fabric of resilience that kept the village whole. Thus, the watch of night was never just a chore. It was a ritual of protection, a quiet devotion, a nightly gift of vigilance and care. Though unrecorded in chronicles and often forgotten in memory, it formed the invisible scaffold on which daily life rested. Without it, households would have been colder, more vulnerable, more afraid. With it, they endured, held steady by the glow of a single flame and the quiet courage of one who remained awake while others dreamed. And so, night after night, the watch continued, linking generations in a rhythm as steady as breath, as enduring as the stars overhead. With dawn came fresh air, dew on fields, and birdsong. Each sunrise offered reassurance. The world continued. Lamps were extinguished, doors unbarred, and villagers stepped once more into fields. Hardship never vanished entirely, but the rhythm of dawn reminded them that light always returned, even after the heaviest night. In a world where survival was often uncertain, where sickness, hunger, and the threat of wolves pressed close, dawn was a quiet miracle, repeated every day, simple yet profound. The faint glow on the horizon told every weary soul that the long night had ended and that life, with all its burdens and blessings, would begin again. The first breaths of morning air carried a coolness different from the heavy silence of night. Dew clung to grasses and thatched roofs, sparkling faintly as the rising sun touched them. For villagers, this freshness signaled cleansing, as though the land itself had been washed and renewed in darkness. Birds began their chorus before the first rays broke across the fields, their calls piercing the lingering quiet. Cocks crowed from barns, and the bleating of livestock added to the growing noise of the new day. Each sound was both ordinary and reassuring, proof that life had endured the night's trials and that the cycle of labor, rest, and resilience continued without fail. Morning rituals were practical but also deeply symbolic. The extinguishing of lamps, for instance, carried with it a sense of victory. The small flame that had guarded the household through the night was no longer needed. Sunlight had returned to claim the task. To set aside the lamp was to affirm that fears could be put away, that the unknown hours of darkness had passed without harm. Unbarring the door echoed this same release. What had been locked against potential danger could now swing open to let in light and neighbors. The household expanded outward once more, ready to join the wider rhythm of village life. The first steps into fields were among the most important gestures of dawn. Whether to tend crops, check fences, or simply stand for a moment in the cool air, these steps affirmed the connection between human life and the land. Hardship was never far away. Failed harvests, poor soil, storms that could destroy in hours what months of labor had built. But dawn offered something stronger than certainty. It offered continuity. No matter the struggle, the fields were there to meet them, wet with dew, alive with song, waiting for hands to work them once more. Each sunrise was therefore not just an event in the sky, but a covenant between land and people, a promise renewed daily that labor and hope still mattered. For those who had kept the night watch, dawn brought both relief and reward. The heaviness of sleepless hours melted with the sight of light stretching across rooftops. To hand the household back to daylight was to complete a task silently born. They could now rest in the knowledge that their vigilance had carried the family through unseen dangers. The moment the sun edged over the horizon often felt like a triumph, quiet but profound, as though one had endured not only personal fatigue, but the greater weight of night itself. In households touched by sickness, dawn was felt even more keenly. A child who had survived the restless fever of midnight breaths easier as sunlight enters the room, and the watcher sitting beside them feels the weight of dread loosen. Each cough softened by morning light seemed less threatening, each labored breath easier to bear. While illness was never vanquished by dawn alone, the presence of daylight gave courage that darkness had eroded. To those who prayed through the long hours of night, dawn felt like an answer, even if incomplete, a gesture of reassurance from the heavens that life still lingered and hope was not foolish. Hardship, of course, never vanished entirely. Villagers knew that dawn did not erase hunger, nor could it banish grief or undo loss. A field struck by blight at dusk remained blighted at dawn. A family grieving still woke to empty beds. Yet dawn carried something more subtle than solutions. It offered continuity, a reminder that even when suffering remained, time itself kept moving, carrying them forward. The rhythm of light and dark provided a structure in which hardship was placed within a larger cycle. It suggested that nothing, not even sorrow, lasted without change. In this way, dawn taught patience, urging endurance with its simple promise that each night, no matter how heavy, must eventually end. Morning labor began quickly. Fires were rekindled to boil water. Bread was baked anew, and animals were let out to pasture. The dew-soaked fields required attention, for every hour of light mattered in seasons of planting and harvest. Men and women alike bent to their tasks, bodies weary but steadied by routine. In the steady rhythm of scythes cutting grass, of hands pulling weeds, of plows breaking soil, there was reassurance. Dawn was not an invitation to idleness, but to action, to join the living world in its constant cycles of growth and decay. Hardship seemed less daunting when broken down into these small acts of persistence, repeated each day under the same rising sun. Children, too, greeted dawn with their own wonder. Though less burdened by responsibility, they shared in its freshness. Running barefoot through wet grass, chasing each other in the pale light, they carried a joy that adults often envied. For them, dawn was not simply survival but discovery. The newness of air, the mystery of fog, the sparkle of dew. Their laughter reminded elders that endurance was not only about labor but about holding on to small moments of beauty. In the midst of hardship, this playfulness carried healing, softening the weight of days that otherwise pressed too heavily. Dawn also reconnected villagers with one another. Neighbors met on paths, exchanging greetings, sharing small news, offering hands in cooperation. Morning was the time when community reassembled, when households ceased to be sealed units of night and instead became threads in a shared fabric. A farmer passing another might lend advice about soil. A mother might ask after a sick child. A shepherd might warn of a wolf seen near the woods. In these exchanges, dawn wove people together, reminding them that endurance was not solitary, but collective. The hardships of life were too heavy for one family alone. Dawn ensured they were shared, eased by many voices. For many, dawn was also spiritual. Bells from distant chapels or monasteries sometimes marked the hour, calling villagers to prayer or simply reminding them of higher rhythms. To bow one's head in the light of first morning was to align earthly labor with divine order. Prayers at dawn often carried gratitude, for the gift of survival through the night was never taken lightly. Even those who lived far from chapels might whisper their own thanks into the cool air, believing that the rising sun itself was a sacred sign. The light that revealed fields and faces seemed also to reveal grace, unspoken but felt. The beauty of dawn was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it crept softly, a faint blue before true brightness. Other times, it came with sudden brilliance, casting long shadows across cottages and barns. Villagers noticed these shifts, for their lives depended on attunement to natural patterns. The quality of dawn could signal weather, a red sky warning of storms, a pale mist suggesting dampness, a golden clarity promising fair work ahead. In this way, dawn was not only emotional reassurance but practical guidance, offering hints for the day's labor. Each morning carried lessons, read carefully by those whose survival depended on such attentiveness. The cycle of night and dawn mirrored the cycle of life itself. Just as households endured hours of darkness and reawakened to light, so too did people endure hardship and discover renewal. Elders often spoke of this rhythm when comforting the young, reminding them that grief, like night, was not endless. They told stories of past winters survived, of famines endured, of sickness that passed, always with the message that light returned. Dawn was therefore both natural and symbolic, a visible emblem of hope woven into daily experience. Each sunrise was a sermon without words, teaching resilience through its constancy. As the day lengthened, the memory of night began to fade, yet its lessons lingered quietly. Those who had kept watch still felt the fatigue of sleepless hours, and those who had worried through illness carried the imprint of fear. But the presence of dawn softened these weights. It reminded them that no burden lasted unchanged, that every hardship was part of a greater rhythm. The endurance of villagers was not heroic in the way of grand tales. It was built of small acts of watching through darkness, of lighting lamps, of stepping into fields at dawn. Together, these acts created a resilience that endured through centuries, sustained by the simple but profound truth that the sun always rose again. In the end, dawn was not merely the start of a day, but the quiet assurance of continuity. It told villagers that life persisted, that hardship could be borne, and that beauty, however modest, could always be found anew. The dew on fields, the call of birds, the opening of doors, these were not just details of routine but signs of hope embodied. And so, every morning, no matter how heavy the night had been, people stepped forward once more into light, carrying with them the knowledge that dawn, after hardship, always came. The story of village life, told through its small patterns of labor, ritual, and rest, is not one of grand events or sudden triumphs. It is instead the quiet weaving of countless ordinary moments, each carrying its own weight and meaning. The songs of evening, the rhythm of hands at work, the long watches of night, and the certainty of dawn, all of these shaped a world where survival was hard, yet never without beauty. To step back and look across the whole pattern is to see that endurance itself was the village's greatest achievement. Not endurance in the sense of stoic strength alone, but in the softer, more human form. The persistence of care, the resilience found in repetition, and the courage of hope renewed each morning. The hardships of their days were undeniable. Illness crept through households, harvests failed, storms threatened to undo what labor had secured, and grief visited without warning. Yet against this backdrop, life did not collapse. It bent, but it did not break. Villagers returned to their tools, their spinning wheels, their songs, and their prayers, finding in these daily acts a rhythm that steadied them. Where great victories were absent, small victories mattered all the more. The lighting of a lamp at dusk, the mending of a garment, the safe return of a shepherd from the field. In these gestures lay the proof that survival was possible, even in the face of uncertainty. Community was the unseen fabric holding everything together. A household might endure the night watch alone, but at dawn, it rejoined the wider village. Paths between cottages were more than dirt tracks. They were lifelines, carrying news, comfort, and shared labor. Neighbors leaned on one another, not as an exception but as a necessity, to share seed, to offer help with repairs, to sit beside the sick, or to exchange greetings in the morning. All were forms of quiet solidarity. Hardship taught them that isolation could not be afforded, and dawn reminded them daily that life was meant to be lived together. Equally important was the relationship between people and the land. Every sunrise revealed not only cottages and faces but fields, meadows, and forests waiting to be tended. The rhythm of dawn and dusk matched the rhythm of sowing and reaping, of growth and decay. Villagers understood that their fate was tied to the earth's cycles, and so they learned to read the subtle signals of sky and soil. The return of light each day was not simply reassurance for the spirit. It was also practical knowledge, marking the time for labor and the promise of harvest. Through this connection, hardship was not only endured, but shared with the natural world, transformed into a larger story of continuity. Songs and prayers carried this sense of endurance into memory. A ballad sung by the hearth was not only entertainment, it was a vessel for history, carrying the struggles and hopes of generations. Prayers whispered at dawn were not only for protection, but for alignment with something larger, something beyond the reach of illness or storm. Music and devotion softened the weight of the present by weaving it into a timeless fabric. They reminded villagers that their hardships, however pressing, were not unique, that others before them had sung the same refrains, prayed the same words, and found strength in the same rhythms. The watches of night perhaps revealed most clearly the courage hidden in ordinary lives. To sit awake while others slept, listening to the silence, was an act of trust and responsibility. Night pressed heavily, full of imagined dangers, yet each watcher knew their small flame mattered. And when dawn finally broke, when lamps were extinguished and doors unbarred, it was not only relief, but victory. The night had not conquered them. Their vigilance had carried the household through. These were not deeds sung in ballads, yet they were the essence of survival unseen, uncelebrated, but vital. Dawn itself stands as the perfect emblem of the village's world. It never erased hardship, never promised a life free of struggle, yet it always arrived unfailingly after the longest and darkest hours. To wake and see the dew on fields, to hear birdsong, to feel cool air against tired skin. These experiences did not undo grief or hunger, but they placed them within a cycle that always moved forward. Dawn taught patience, endurance, and above all, hope. Its lesson was simple yet profound. Nothing remained in darkness forever. To reflect on this way of life is to understand that beauty and hardship were not opposites, but companions. The beauty of birdsong was heightened by the silence of the night that preceded it. The sweetness of bread tasted better for the labor it required. The joy of children running through dew was brighter because adults knew the weight of worry. Even grief was tempered by memory, softened by songs that turned sorrow into shared heritage. In every pattern of their days, the villagers lived with both weight and lightness, bound together in a rhythm that carried them forward. For us, looking back across centuries, there is something strangely comforting in this simplicity. Our world is different in its technologies and comforts, but not in its uncertainties. We still face nights of fear, days of labor, and seasons of hardship, and like those villagers, we still look for signs of reassurance, for patterns that remind us we are not lost. The daily rising of the sun, unchanged across all ages, speaks to us as it did to them. It tells us that endurance is possible, that hardship is never the whole story, and that renewal is always waiting. Thus the conclusion is not one of finality, but of continuity. The villagers' lives, with their songs, their watches, and their dawns, remind us that history is not only written in great events, but in the persistence of ordinary people. Their world was fragile, yet they endured. Their hardships were many, yet they found beauty. Their nights were long, yet dawn always came, and so it is for us. The patterns of resilience they lived by remain echoes in our own lives, quiet reminders that the rhythm of light and dark continues, steady and sure. The story ends, then, not with triumph or despair, but with the image of a village at dawn. Doors open, lamps extinguished, voices greeting the morning, fields glisten with dew, children laugh, elders stretch their weary limbs, and neighbors nod in quiet recognition. Life continues, not perfect, not easy, but enduring. The hardships of the night are not forgotten, but they are softened by the return of light. And in that light, villagers step forward once more, carrying with them the simple yet unbreakable truth that dawn, after hardship, always returns.